The tent canvas screamed against the wind as Clara Jennings pressed her 3 children close, one hand clutching a rusted revolver, the other holding her youngest daughter who wouldn't stop crying from hunger. 3 months of surviving on the Wyoming plains had brought them to this, the edge of existence. Then hoofbeats. A shadow appeared through the storm. Her finger found the trigger as a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Ma'am, you can't stay out here tonight." It was a cowboy she'd never seen before, and he was about to change everything. But before I tell you how this desperate mother's life transformed from sleeping in dirt to finding unexpected love, please stay with me until the end of this story and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far Clara's journey has traveled across the world. The Wyoming Territory had no mercy in the summer of 1873, and Clara Jennings had learned that lesson written in dust, hunger, and the constant ache of loss that settled in her bones like an old injury that wouldn't heal. She sat now in the fading light outside the pathetic structure she couldn't honestly call a tent anymore. It was more a collection of torn canvas, rotting rope, and desperate prayers that somehow still managed to provide a few square feet of shade during the scorching days and inadequate shelter when the temperature plummeted at night. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to kneading bread dough in a proper kitchen, now bore calluses and cuts that refused to heal, the price of trying to dig for roots, gather what little dried brush existed for fires, and stretch every scrap of fabric to keep her children covered. Emma, her oldest at 8 years, sat beside her with that too serious expression that broke Clara's heart daily. No child should look that old, that worried, that aware of how close to the edge they all teetered. The girl's blonde hair, once carefully braided and ribboned, now hung in matted tangles that Clara had given up trying to comb weeks ago when the last of their water had to be rationed for drinking rather than washing. Emma's dress, the only one she owned now, had been patched so many times the original fabric was difficult to identify beneath the mismatched squares of material Clara had salvaged from her own clothing. 5-year-old Samuel played in the dirt nearby, his thin arms pushing around a stick he pretended was a horse, making clip-clop sounds that would have been endearing if they weren't so heartbreaking. The boy had stopped asking when they'd have a real meal, when they could sleep in a real bed, when Papa was coming back. He'd learned those questions had no good answers. Instead, he'd retreated into silence and imagination, creating a world in the dust that was better than the one he actually inhabited. And then there was little Grace, barely 3 years old, who dozed fitfully in Clara's lap, whimpering even in sleep. The child was too thin, her cheeks hollow, her eyes too large in her small face. Clara felt the terrible lightness of her daughter's body and knew with sick certainty that they couldn't survive much longer like this. Grace needed real food, real shelter, real care, and Clara had none of those things to give her. 3 months. It had been 3 months since Thomas died. The memory still had the power to steal Clara's breath. Her husband, strong, capable Thomas, who had promised her a new life out west, who had sworn he'd build them a ranch and a future, had been taken by fever in less than a week. One day he'd been unloading their wagon at the land claim office in Green River, planning where he'd break ground for their house. The next, he was burning with heat, delirious, crying out for water Clara couldn't keep cool enough to ease his suffering. The town doctor had done what he could, which wasn't much. Frontier medicine in 1873 amounted to little more than hope and prayer, and neither had been enough. Thomas died on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving Clara with 3 children, a wagon with a broken axle, approximately $7 in coins, and a land claim that required improvements within 6 months, improvements she had no means to make and no knowledge of how to attempt. The wagon had been sold to pay for Thomas's burial. The money had run out within weeks. The land claim had lapsed when Clara couldn't even afford the filing fees, let alone make any improvements. And slowly, inevitably, everything else had been sold or traded. Their extra clothes, Thomas's tools, the good cookware, even Clara's wedding ring, which she'd parted with in exchange for a sack of cornmeal and a promise from a dry goods merchant that he'd remember she had children to feed. He hadn't remembered. Or if he had, it hadn't mattered. For 3 months now, they'd been living in this tent, if you could call it living, on the outskirts of Green River, technically on public land where she had no legal right to be but where no one had bothered to move them along yet. Perhaps because everyone assumed they'd die or disappear on their own soon enough. And they probably would have, Clara thought grimly, if something didn't change soon. She'd tried to find work. God knew she'd tried. But Green River was a small ranching town with few opportunities for women, especially women with 3 small children in tow. The respectable families didn't want a destitute widow in their homes, worried about theft or impropriety. The less respectable establishments had made offers Clara refused to even consider, no matter how hungry her children were. She had her pride, yes, but more than that, she had her children to protect. And she knew once you stepped through certain doors, you never walked back out the same person. So she'd scrape by on odd jobs, washing in the river for a few cents, occasionally selling prairie flowers to sympathetic townswomen, once even catching and selling rabbits, until Samuel had cried so hard at the sight of the dead animals that she couldn't bring herself to do it again. Her son needed food, yes, but he also needed some remaining innocence, and she wasn't ready to take that from him completely. The revolver beside her on the ground was Thomas's, a Navy Colt that she barely knew how to use but kept loaded and within reach at all times. The Wyoming Territory in 1873 was no place for a defenseless woman alone with children. She'd already had to brandish it twice at men who'd gotten the wrong idea about a woman living in a tent without a man's protection. She hadn't fired it, didn't trust her aim, and couldn't spare the ammunition, but the sight of it had been enough both times. So far. Now, as the sun sank lower and the wind picked up, the kind of wind that preceded the violent summer storms that rolled across the plains with little warning, Clara felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest. The tent wouldn't hold in a serious storm. It barely held in calm weather. If the wind got bad enough, they'd have to huddle together on the open ground and pray the lightning missed them. "Mama?" Emma's voice was small. "Should we move inside?" Inside. The word was almost funny. Inside meant crawling into the stuffy, cramped space beneath the sagging canvas, where the temperature was somehow both suffocating and chilling, where spiders dropped from the ceiling and scorpions occasionally wandered in looking for shade, where the smell of unwashed bodies and unchanged baby cloths in desperation clung to every breath. "Not yet, sweetheart," Clara said, smoothing her daughter's matted hair. "Let's enjoy the breeze a little longer." Emma nodded, too mature for her years, understanding what her mother didn't say, that Clara would rather face the weather than the crushing reality of their shelter for as long as possible. The sky was darkening now, not just from the approaching dusk, but from storm clouds building to the west, massive and ominous, the kind that could bring hail and torrential rain and wind strong enough to tear a tent from its moorings. Clara's stomach clenched. They needed to prepare what little they could. Bring the water bucket inside, make sure Samuel came in before it hit, maybe try to drive the tent stakes deeper into the hard ground. She was just about to wake Grace and move everyone when she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats. Clara's hand went immediately to the revolver, her fingers closing around the worn grip as she rose to her feet, depositing Grace gently on the ground where the child stirred but didn't fully wake. Emma scrambled up beside her mother, and Samuel stopped playing, his stick horse forgotten as he watched a lone rider emerge from the gathering gloom. The man was tall in the saddle, wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind, a dark coat despite the summer heat, and the unmistakable bearing of someone who spent his life on horseback. His horse, a sturdy sorrel mare, moved with the easy gait of an animal well cared for and sure-footed on the rough terrain. Clara's heart hammered as she raised the revolver, not quite pointing it at the stranger, but making sure he could see it in her hand. She'd learned that hesitation invited trouble, and the last thing she needed right now was trouble. "That's close enough," she called out, proud that her voice didn't shake despite the fear coursing through her veins. "State your business and move along." The rider reined his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, far enough to be non-threatening, but close enough that Clara could make out his features in the fading light. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair visible beneath his hat, a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes that were hard to read in the dimness, but seemed to be assessing the situation with more concern than menace. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice steady and deep, carrying easily over the rising wind. "Name's Rowan Tate. I'm the foreman at Dusty Spur Ranch about 5 miles east of here." He paused, glancing at the tent, at the children, at Clara's defensive posture. "Mean no harm. Just riding back from town and saw your camp. Got a storm coming in hard. You and the young ones planning to ride it out here?" Clara's grip on the revolver didn't loosen. Our plans are our own business, Mr. Tate. Thank you for your concern, but we'll manage. Even as she said it, a particularly strong gust of wind hit the tent, and Clara heard the ominous sound of canvas ripping further, one of the support ropes snapping with a sound like a gunshot. Emma gasped and pressed against her mother's side. Rowan Tate's expression tightened. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening, his hands visible. Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect, but that tent's not going to last through what's coming. I can see it's torn in 3 places already, and those stakes won't hold in mud once the rain starts. If the wind gets under that canvas— We've weathered storms before, Clara interrupted, but her voice lacked conviction. They had weathered storms, but barely, and never one of the serious summer tempests that could turn deadly in minutes. I'm sure you have, Rowan said calmly. He was closer now, having walked his horse forward a few steps, and Clara could see his face more clearly. There was no threat in it, no predatory calculation she'd learned to watch for in men's eyes. Instead, there was something that looked almost like concern, maybe even compassion, which made her even more wary. In her experience, men didn't offer compassion without expecting something in return. But ma'am, he continued, this one's going to be bad. I've seen that sky before. You got, maybe 20 minutes before it hits, and when it does, he gestured at the tent. That's not going to protect anyone. You'll be better off in the open if it comes down, and that's no place for children in hail and lightning. As if to punctuate his words, thunder rumbled in the distance, deep and threatening. Grace woke with a startled cry, and Samuel abandoned his play area to run to Clara's side, wrapping his thin arms around her legs. Clara felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Pride said to send this stranger away, to handle this crisis the way they'd handled everything else, alone, desperate, barely surviving. But maternal instinct, the fierce drive to protect her children that had kept her fighting through 3 months of hell, whispered something different. What if he was right? What if the tent came down in the storm? What if hail started falling and she had no way to cover the children? What if lightning struck close and they were pinned under wet canvas with nowhere to run? She'd been so focused on maintaining her dignity, on not becoming an object of charity or worse, that she hadn't fully considered that her pride might actually cost her children's lives. Mama? Emma whispered. I'm scared. The wind gusted again, harder this time, and Clara felt the first cold drops of rain on her face. The storm was coming faster than she'd thought. Rowan Tate stood there, patient, his hat now in his hands in a gesture of respect, waiting for her decision. Up close, Claire could see he wasn't just some drifter or opportunist. His clothes, while worn, were well maintained. His boots were good quality, his horse healthy and calm. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own capability, and didn't need to prove it through aggression or intimidation. What exactly are you offering, Mr. Tate? Clara heard herself ask, hating the slight tremor in her voice, but needing to understand the terms before she committed to anything. There's a foreman's cabin about a mile from here, Rowan said promptly. Been empty for a few months since the last foreman moved on. It's nothing fancy, 1 room, stone fireplace, wooden floor, solid roof, but it's dry and it's safe. I'm offering to take you and your children there for the night, get you out of this storm. Tomorrow, in the daylight, you can make whatever decisions you need to make. But tonight, he glanced at the darkening sky. Tonight, you need to be somewhere that canvas and tent stakes can't fail you. And what do you expect in return? The question came out harder than Clara intended, but she had to know. She'd learned that nothing came without a price, especially not kindness from strangers. Rowan's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment something that might have been hurt flashed in his eyes before his expression smoothed into neutrality. Nothing, ma'am. You'd be doing me a favor, honestly. That cabin should have someone in it keeping the roof from leaking and the critters from moving in. You'd be helping maintain ranch property. It was a lie, Clara knew, a polite fiction to let her accept help without feeling like charity, but it was a kind lie, and she found herself desperately wanting to believe it. Another crack of thunder, closer now, made the decision for her. All right, she said softly, then louder as the wind picked up. All right, we'll accept your offer, Mr. Tate, but just for tonight, just until the storm passes. If Rowan felt any triumph or satisfaction at her acceptance, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded and immediately started moving with practiced efficiency. Good. We need to move fast. Ma'am, can you gather what you need quickly? Essentials only. We'll be on horseback and the rain's about to start in earnest. Clara's mind raced. Essentials. What did they have that qualified as essential? Everything they owned was already essential by definition. But she knew what he meant. What could they carry on horseback in a storm? Emma, she said quickly, get the water bucket and the blankets from inside the tent. Samuel, grab your sister's hand and don't let go. Mr. Tate, can you help me with… She didn't finish the sentence because at that moment, the wind hit with the force of something alive and angry. The tent didn't just flutter or bend. It seemed to explode upward as if a giant hand had grabbed it and yanked. The main support pole snapped with a crack. Canvas tore with a sound like screaming, and suddenly the entire structure was collapsing in on itself, stakes pulling free from the ground and the whole mess tumbling across the dirt like massive tumbleweed. Grace shrieked. Samuel started crying. Emma stood frozen, staring at the destruction of what had been their home, inadequate as it was. Clara felt her stomach plummet. Everything they owned, their few clothes, Thomas's razor she'd kept as a memento, the small tin box with a lock of each child's baby hair, the Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, all of it was now trapped under that tangle of canvas and broken poles. And the rain was starting in earnest, fat drops that hit the ground with enough force to bounce. The tent, she started, but Rowan was already moving. No time, he called over the rising wind. We save the children first. Come back for belongings if we can. Up you go. Before Clara could fully process what was happening, Rowan had scooped up Grace with one arm, the little girl too surprised to do more than grab onto his coat, and was swinging Samuel up onto his horse with the other. The sorrel mare stood rock steady despite the chaos, trained for this kind of work. Emma, can you climb up behind your brother? Rowan asked, and the girl nodded, her face pale but determined. She scrambled up with more grace than Clara would have expected, settling behind Samuel and wrapping her arms around her younger brother's waist. Rowan turned to Clara, still holding Grace against his chest. Ma'am, you'll ride with me. We'll double up. The horse can handle it for a mile, especially with the young ones so light. Clara's pride made one last stand. I can walk. In this? Rowan gestured at the storm that was now fully upon them, rain coming down in sheets, hail beginning to mix in with drops that stung exposed skin. With respect, ma'am, that's foolishness. We need to move now, or in 5 minutes we won't be able to see our hands in front of our faces. He was right. Clara knew he was right. Pride was one thing, stupidity was another. She reached up, and Rowan's free hand gripped her forearm with surprising strength, helping her scramble awkwardly onto the horse behind the children. The mare shifted but held steady, and Clara found herself pressed close against Emma's back, her arms wrapping around all three of her children as Rowan mounted behind her, Grace still tucked securely in the crook of his left arm, while his right hand gathered the reins. It was intimate in a way that made Clara deeply uncomfortable. She hadn't been this close to a man other than Thomas in years, could feel the solid warmth of Rowan's chest against her back, the strength of his arm as it came around all of them to hold the reins. But discomfort was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Hold tight, Rowan said near her ear, his voice somehow calm despite the chaos. It's going to be rough. The mare launched into a canter before Clara could respond, and suddenly they were moving through the storm, rain lashing at them from every direction, the world reduced to flashes of lightning that illuminated the plains in stark white bursts, followed by darkness so complete Clara couldn't see anything at all. She held her children tight, felt Grace crying against Rowan's chest, heard Samuel whimpering, felt Emma trembling but silent. The ride seemed to last forever and no time at all. Clara lost all sense of direction, simply trusting that this stranger knew where he was going, hoping desperately that she hadn't made a terrible mistake in accepting his help. Then, through the rain, she saw it. The dark shape of a structure, small but solid-looking, barely visible through the downpour. The cabin. Rowan guided the horse right up to what must have been the front door, and in another flash of lightning, Clara could see it clearly. A single-room cabin, log walls, stone chimney, a covered porch that was currently providing blessed protection from the worst of the rain. Inside, quickly! Rowan was off the horse in one smooth motion, reaching up to take Grace, then helping Samuel and Emma down, finally offering Clara his hand to dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. She wasn't used to riding, especially not in those conditions, but Rowan's hand steadied her, his grip firm but not constraining. "The door's unlocked," he said, already pushing it open to reveal darkness within. "Get everyone inside. I need to tend to the horse. Get her under cover. I'll be back in 2 minutes." Clara gathered her children and stumbled into the cabin just as another crack of thunder shook the sky. Behind her, she heard Rowan leading the mare away, presumably to some kind of shelter that must exist nearby. For a moment, they all just stood there in the darkness, dripping and shaking, too stunned to do anything else. Then Emma found her voice. "Mama, are we safe?" Clara wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise that they were safe, that everything would be fine, that the strange cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere was trustworthy and kind, and that this cabin represented salvation rather than a different kind of danger. But she'd learned in the past 3 months that promises were fragile things, easily broken, and that safety was an illusion that could be shattered in a moment. So instead, she simply pulled her children close and said, "We're out of the storm. That's enough for right now." And they stood there in the darkness, listening to the thunder rage outside, waiting to see what would happen when Rowan Tate came back through that door. Well, the door opened perhaps 3 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity, and Rowan stepped inside, rain streaming from his hat and coat. He closed the door firmly behind him, shutting out the worst of the storm's fury, and Clara heard him moving in the darkness with the confidence of someone familiar with the space. "There's a lamp here somewhere," he muttered, and she heard the sound of fumbling, glass clinking, then the scratch of a match. Light flared, small at first as Rowan lit a lamp on a table near the door, but it grew and spread as he adjusted the wick, and for the first time Clara could see the cabin properly. It was, as Rowan had said, nothing fancy. One large room, maybe 15 feet square, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a narrow window on each of the other 3 walls, and a plank floor that was weathered but solid. There was a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall with a thin mattress, a small wood stove in addition to the fireplace, and several shelves that held a few basic supplies, tin plates, cups, what looked like a sack of cornmeal. Compared to the tent that had been their home for 3 months, it looked like a palace. Grace had stopped crying and was staring around with wide eyes. Samuel's hand had loosened its death grip on Clara's skirt. Even Emma seemed to relax slightly, her 2 thin shoulders dropping from their hunched defensive position. "It's not much," Rowan said, moving to the fireplace where wood had been laid ready to light. "But it's dry, and it's solid. Let me get this fire going. You're all soaked through and need to warm up." Clara found her voice, though it came out shakier than she intended. "Mr. Tate, we're dripping all over your floor." He glanced up from where he was kneeling by the fireplace, another match in hand. In the lamplight, his face looked younger than she'd initially thought. Maybe late 20s rather than early 30s, with strong features and eyes that were a surprising light brown, almost amber. "It's a floor. It'll dry. Your people. That's more important." The simple matter-of-factness of the statement, delivered without any sense of self-righteousness or expectation of gratitude, did something to Clara's carefully maintained emotional walls. She felt them crack, just slightly, and had to look away before tears could form. Rowan got the fire going with the efficiency of long practice, and within minutes warmth was beginning to spread through the cabin. The storm raged outside. Clara could hear the rain hammering the roof, the wind shrieking around the corners. But inside, with the lamp glowing and the fire crackling and solid walls around them, it felt almost safe. "Now then," Rowan said, standing and dusting his hands on his pants. "Let's get you all situated. There should be some old blankets in that chest by the bed. They'll be musty, but they're dry. Ma'am, why don't you help the children out of those wet clothes and wrap them up warm? I'll see what I can find for supper." The casual mention of supper made Samuel's head whip around so fast Clara heard his neck crack. "Supper?" the boy breathed as if Rowan had just promised a feast. Something flickered across Rowan's face. Pain, maybe, or anger, though Clara sensed it wasn't directed at them. "Yes, son. Supper. Can't have you going to bed hungry, can we?" Clara's throat tightened. It had been 2 days since they'd had what could reasonably be called a meal rather than just scraps. The children were hungry in a deep, chronic way that had become their normal state. The fact that this stranger seemed to understand that, seemed to care about that, was almost more than she could process. "Mr. Tate," she started, but he held up a hand. "Just Rowan, please." "Mr. Tate was my father, and he wasn't a man worth the title." He moved to the shelves, pulling down the cornmeal sack and what looked like a jar of preserves. "And before you tell me again that you don't want charity, let me say this. I'm the foreman of Dusty Spur. Part of my job is maintaining the line cabins and keeping them stocked with basics in case any of the hands need to use them. This cabin, those supplies, they're not mine personally. They belong to the ranch, and you're using ranch property, so you're not taking anything from me. You understand?" It was another kind lie, and they both knew it. But Clara was tired, so tired, of fighting, of pride, of pretending they didn't desperately need help. So she simply nodded and turned her attention to her children. The blankets in the chest were indeed musty, but they were thick wool and blessedly dry. Clara helped her children out of their wet, filthy clothes, trying not to notice how prominent their ribs were, how thin their arms had become. She wrapped each of them in blankets until they looked like small, damp cocoons, and settled them on the floor near the fire where they could warm up. Grace immediately stuck her thumb in her mouth and leaned against Emma, her eyes already drooping with exhaustion. Samuel sat very still, watching Rowan with a mix of hope and distrust that broke Clara's heart. Emma, ever the responsible one, kept glancing at Clara as if checking to make sure her mother was still there, still in control, still keeping them safe. Clara's own dress was soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her skin, but she had nothing to change into. Everything they'd owned had been in that tent, and now it was buried under collapsed canvas in the mud, probably ruined beyond recovery. The realization that they literally had nothing now except the wet clothes on their backs was almost overwhelming. "There's a shirt and some pants in that chest too," Rowan said without looking up from where he was mixing something in a bowl. "They'll be too big, but at least they're dry. There's a blanket you can hold up in the corner there for privacy." Clara felt heat rush to her face. The intimacy of a strange man telling her to change clothes in his presence was shocking, improper, the kind of thing that would scandalize anyone from her old life back east. But that life was gone, and propriety was another luxury she couldn't afford. Hypothermia cared nothing for social conventions. "Thank you," she managed, retrieving the clothing and the blanket Rowan indicated. She rigged up a makeshift privacy screen in the corner farthest from the fire, acutely aware that it was fairly useless. Rowan could probably see her shadow through the thin blanket, but at least it was something. She peeled off her wet dress, her underthings that were torn and stained from months of hard living, and pulled on the dry clothes. The shirt hung past her thighs, the pants had to be rolled up several times at the ankle, and she had to tie a piece of rope around the waist to keep them from falling off. She looked ridiculous, she was sure, but she was dry. When she emerged from behind the blanket, Rowan glanced up briefly, nodded once as if satisfied she wasn't going to freeze to death, and returned his attention to cooking. If he found anything amusing or inappropriate about her appearance, he didn't show it. The smell of cooking cornmeal and something else, beans maybe, was making Clara lightheaded with hunger. She realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, having given her small portion to Grace, who had been crying from hunger pains. "Should be ready in about 10 minutes, Rowan said, stirring the pot that now hung over the fire. "It's just Johnny cakes and beans, nothing fancy, but it'll fill your bellies." "It smells like heaven," Emma whispered, and Clara had to agree. Those 10 minutes felt longer than the entire storm ride. Clara tried to make herself useful by tidying up the wet clothes, hanging them near the fire to dry, but mostly she just watched Rowan work, trying to understand what kind of man he was. He moved with economy and purpose, no wasted motion, the sign of someone who'd been taking care of himself for a long time. His hands were calloused and scarred, working hands, hands that had seen hard labor and harsh conditions. But they were also careful hands, she noticed, precise as he spooned out portions onto the tin plates. When he finally announced the food was ready, Samuel actually whimpered with anticipation. Rowan served the children first, generous portions that made Clara want to weep because she knew she couldn't feed them like this, not consistently, probably not ever again, and then fixed plates for Clara and himself. Clara was about to suggest he give her portion to the children as well, but Rowan seemed to read her mind. "You need to eat too, ma'am," he said firmly. Can't take care of them if you collapse from hunger. Trust me on that." So she ate, and it was one of the best meals she'd ever had despite being simple frontier fare. The Johnny cakes were hot and filling, the beans were seasoned with some kind of pork fat that made them rich and satisfying, and there was enough that everyone could eat their fill without anyone going hungry. Clara watched her children devour their food with the desperate intensity of the truly starving, and she felt tears prick her eyes again. How had she let it get this bad? How had she allowed her children to become so hungry that plain cornmeal cakes made them weep with gratitude? "Hey now," Rowan said softly, and Clara realized a tear had escaped down her cheek. "None of that. You're doing fine. You got them this far, didn't you? That's no small thing." "I failed them," Clara whispered, low enough that the children wouldn't hear. 3 months I've been failing them every single day." "You've kept them alive," Rowan countered. "In this territory, in these conditions, as a woman alone? That's not failure, ma'am. That's a damn miracle." The profanity should have shocked her, but instead it felt oddly comforting, the rough honesty of it, after so many months of polite society telling her to smile and make do and trust in Providence while her children starved. After supper, the children could barely keep their eyes open. The combination of full bellies, warmth, and emotional exhaustion from the storm was overwhelming. Rowan gave up his bed without hesitation, helping Clara arrange all 3 children on the narrow mattress, where they curled together like puppies, asleep almost before their heads touched the pillow. Clara stood looking down at them, her heart so full of relief and gratitude and residual fear that she could barely breathe. They looked peaceful for the first time in months, not just sleeping, but actually resting, their small faces relaxed, the constant tension of survival temporarily eased. "They'll sleep well tonight," Rowan said quietly from beside her. "Safe and fed and dry. That's what matters." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood there in silence for a moment, watching the children sleep, listening to the storm continue its assault on the cabin walls. Finally, Clara found her voice. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you help us? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Why would you do this?" Rowan was quiet for so long Clara thought he might not answer. Then, still looking at the sleeping children, he said, "When I was about that boy's age, maybe 5 or 6, my mother was in a situation similar to yours. My father had abandoned us, drunk away what little money we had. We were living in a boarding house in Kansas City, about a week away from being thrown out onto the street. And then a woman, a widow who ran a bakery, found out somehow. She never said how, but she offered my mother a job and a room above the bakery for us to live in. No questions asked, no judgment passed, just help when we desperately needed it." He paused, his jaw working as if the memory was still painful. "My mother always said she'd never be able to repay that kindness, not fully, but that maybe she didn't need to repay it. Maybe she just needed to pass it forward when she had the chance. Help someone else the way she'd been helped." He turned to look at Clara then, and his eyes were serious. "She died before she ever got that chance. Consumption took her when I was 12. But before she passed, she made me promise I'd remember what that baker did for us. Made me swear that if I ever had the means to help someone who was struggling the way we struggled, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't let pride or fear or propriety stop me from doing what was right." Clara felt something shift in her chest, her carefully maintained suspicion cracking. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said softly. "Me too." Rowan's voice was rough. "But her lesson stuck. So when I saw you and those children in that tent, with that storm coming," he shrugged. "I heard her voice in my head, clear as if she was standing next to me, and I knew what I had to do." "I don't know how to thank you," Clara whispered. "Then don't," Rowan said simply. "Just rest tonight. Let your children sleep safe. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next. But tonight, you've got a roof over your head, and food in your belly, and dry clothes. That's enough for now." And it was. Clara knew that tomorrow would bring a whole new set of problems and decisions and fears. But tonight they were safe. Tonight they were warm. Tonight her children were sleeping peacefully, not crying from hunger or shivering from cold or whimpering in fear of the storms. Tonight was enough. Clara woke to silence, and for a confused, disoriented moment couldn't remember where she was. The silence itself was wrong. For 3 months she'd woken to the sound of wind flapping canvas, to the rustle of insects, to the open emptiness of the plains. But now there was only quiet, broken by the soft breathing of her children and the faint crackle of embers in a fireplace. A fireplace. Memory flooded back, the storm, the stranger, the ride through rain and darkness, this cabin. She sat up quickly, her borrowed shirt twisted around her torso, and looked around the dim interior. Dawn light filtered through the windows, weak and gray, but enough to see by. The children were still asleep on the bed, tangled together in the wool blankets. Grace had her thumb in her mouth, Samuel was sprawled on his back, with one arm thrown over his eyes, and Emma was curled protectively around both of them, even in sleep taking on the role of guardian. They looked so peaceful, so young, in a way they hadn't looked in months, and Clara felt her chest tighten with a complicated mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Rowan was nowhere to be seen. Clara stood carefully, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard floor near the fire, where she'd insisted on making her bed after the children had been settled. She'd refused to take the bed from Rowan, and after a brief argument that she'd won through sheer stubborn determination, he'd accepted the floor on the opposite side of the cabin, maintaining a respectful distance that had eased some of her anxiety about spending the night in a strange man's shelter. But now he was gone, and Clara felt a spike of panic. Had he left? Had last night been some kind of elaborate setup, and now she'd wake to find herself trapped here, or owing some debt she couldn't pay, or... The door opened, cutting off her spiraling thoughts, and Rowan stepped inside carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw she was awake, nodding a quiet greeting. "Morning," he said, his voice low so as not to wake the children. "Storm passed about an hour ago. Thought I'd get the fire built back up and check on things outside." Clara swallowed her panic, feeling foolish for her immediate assumption of danger. "Is there... how much damage?" Rowan set the wood down near the fireplace and began building up the fire. "Some flooding in the low areas, a few trees down. Your tent..." He paused, and Clara could read the answer in his hesitation. "Your tent's pretty well destroyed, ma'am. I rode out at first light to see if anything could be salvaged. Most of what was inside is soaked through and scattered. I gathered what I could find and brought it back on the horse. It's not much." Clara had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a blow. "I see," she managed. "Thank you for checking. There's some clothes, wet but maybe salvageable if we can get them clean and dried proper. A tin box that stayed sealed. Some cooking things. The canvas itself is torn beyond use, I'm afraid." Rowan worked as he talked, his hand steady on the wood. "I left it all on the porch to drain, didn't want to bring the mud inside." "Of course." Clara felt numb. Everything. They'd lost everything. Not that they'd had much, but still. Thomas's razor, the children's few toys, her grandmother's Bible, the photographs of her parents that had been wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of their traveling trunk. All of it gone, scattered across the Wyoming plains or buried in mud. "The tin box," Rowan said carefully, glancing at her. "It had some papers in it. Looked important, so I made sure it was secure. And there was something wrapped in cloth that felt like it might be a book?" Clara's breath caught. "The Bible?" "Checked it. The oilcloth held. It's damp around the edges, but readable." Something that might have been relief crossed Rowan's face. "Figured that might matter to you." It shouldn't have made such a difference. It was just a book, just an object. But Clara felt tears well up. Her grandmother's Bible, the one she'd carried from Boston when she married, the one with all the family names written in the front, the one she'd planned to pass down to Emma someday. It had survived. "Thank you," she whispered. Thank you for saving it." Rowan looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just did what anyone would do," he muttered, turning back to the fire. Within minutes he had it blazing cheerfully, warmth spreading through the cabin and chasing away the damp chill of morning. Clara hugged herself, acutely aware of how she must look. Unwashed, wearing clothes far too large, her hair a tangled mess after sleeping on the floor. In her old life, she would have been mortified to be seen like this. But that life was so far away now, it might as well have belonged to a different person entirely. "I should wake the children," she said. "We've imposed on your hospitality long enough. If you could point us toward town..." "And then what?" Rowan interrupted, not unkindly. He stood, dusting his hands, and turned to face her fully. You'll walk 5 miles into Green River with 3 children, no shelter, and maybe $7 to your name if you're lucky. And do what, exactly? Clara stiffened. That's not your concern, Mr. Tate. Rowan, he corrected. And actually, I'm making it my concern. Because if I let you walk out of here with those children and no plan, I'm essentially sending you right back to the situation I pulled you out of last night. Probably worse, since now you don't even have a tent. I'll find work. In Green River? Rowan's tone was gentle but firm. Ma'am. Clara, if I may, I mean no disrespect, but you've been trying to find work in Green River for 3 months. What makes you think today will be different? The use of her given name should have shocked her, but instead it just felt tired. He was right, and they both knew it. She had no prospects, no resources, no options. Last night's storm hadn't just destroyed their tent. It had destroyed the last pretense that they could continue as they had been. I don't know, Clara admitted, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know what to do. But I can't. We can't keep accepting charity from a stranger. It's not right. People will talk, and the children— People always talk, Rowan said. That's what people do. But last I checked, talk doesn't keep children fed and sheltered. Actions do. He moved to the shelf and began pulling down supplies for breakfast. Here's what I propose. You and the children stay here in this cabin for now. It's not being used anyway. You keep the place clean. Maybe do some mending work for the ranch hands. Lord knows they need it. Bunch of bachelors with more holes in their clothes than fabric. That's not charity. That's honest work in exchange for housing. Clara stared at him. You're offering us a place to live? I'm offering you the use of an empty cabin that was just going to sit here collecting dust and mice anyway, Rowan corrected. And I'm offering you work, real work, paid work, if you want it. The main ranch house is run by Mrs. Chen, the owner's housekeeper, and she's been complaining for months that she needs help with the mending and such. The ranch owner, Mr. Blackwood, he's getting old and his hands shake something terrible. He can barely sign his own name anymore, much less mend a shirt. The operation needs someone who can sew. It sounded too good to be true, which immediately made Clara suspicious. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Rowan met her eyes steadily. Peace of mind. The knowledge that 3 children aren't starving on the plains. The ability to sleep at night without wondering if I should have done more. He paused. And maybe the feeling that I finally kept the promise I made to my mother all those years ago. Behind them, one of the children stirred. Emma sat up slowly, blinking in confusion at her surroundings before memory clearly returned. Her eyes found Clara, checking that her mother was still there, still safe, and only then did the tension leave her small shoulders. Mama? She said softly. Where are we? We're in Mr. Tate's, in Rowan's cabin, Clara said, moving to the bedside. How did you sleep, sweetheart? Good, Emma whispered, wonder in her voice. I slept really good, Mama. I didn't wake up cold even once. The simple statement was like a knife to Clara's heart. What kind of mother had she been, that her daughter considered sleeping through the night without shivering to be a miracle worth commenting on? Samuel was waking now too, and Grace, rubbing their eyes and looking around with the confused expression of children in an unfamiliar place. But unlike Emma, they didn't look frightened, just curious. Who's hungry? Rowan asked, and Samuel's hand shot up so fast he nearly fell off the bed, making both adults smile despite the heavy conversation that had preceded it. Breakfast was more cornmeal cakes, this time with some molasses that turned them sweet enough to make Grace giggle with delight. Clara tried to help with the cooking, but Rowan waved her off, saying she should tend to the children first, get them cleaned up and presentable. There's a creek about 100 yards south of the cabin, he said. Water's cold but clean. I can heat some here on the fire if you'd rather, make it easier for washing up. The consideration in the offer, the thoughtfulness of it, was almost more than Clara could process. For 3 months, every small task had been a struggle, every basic need a challenge. And now here was this man, this stranger, making sure there was warm water for washing, making sure the children were fed, offering them shelter and work and dignity. It had to be too good to be true. In Clara's experience, nothing came without strings, especially not from men. But she was tired, so desperately tired, of fighting every moment of every day. Maybe, just maybe, She could accept this help, just for a little while, just until she figured out what came next. "Warm water would be appreciated," she said quietly. "Thank you." While Rowan heated water and finished preparing breakfast, Clara did her best to make her children presentable. Their clothes from the night before were still damp but wearable, and she dressed them carefully, trying to ignore how thin they'd become, how fragile they felt under her hands. She combed Grace's hair with her fingers, smoothed Samuel's cowlick, helped Emma tuck in her dress. They ate breakfast together around the small table, Clara and the children squeezing onto one bench while Rowan took the chair across from them. It felt almost domestic, almost normal, like a real family having a real meal in a real home. The feeling was so foreign after months of chaos that Clara had to focus on her food to keep from crying. "So here's what I'm thinking," Rowan said once the children had demolished their portions and were eyeing the pot, hopefully for seconds, which he served without hesitation. "Today we'll get you settled in here properly. There's blankets and such stored in the bunkhouse I can bring over. Maybe another chair or two. Get your salvaged belongings dried out and sorted. Tomorrow, if you're agreeable to my proposal, I'll introduce you to Mrs. Chen and we can discuss the mending work." Clara swallowed her pride, her fear, her deeply ingrained suspicion. That would be acceptable. Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for," Rowan said, but his eyes showed relief that she'd agreed. "You'll be doing the ranch a service and earning your keep honestly. No charity involved." After breakfast, Rowan left to tend to his regular duties. He was the foreman, after all, and had responsibilities beyond helping stranded widows. But before he left, he showed Clara around the cabin more thoroughly, pointing out where various supplies were stored, explaining that the well was about 50 yards north and the outhouse was behind a stand of cottonwoods to the east. "I'll be back this evening," he said from the doorway, "probably around sundown. If you need anything before then, the main ranch house is about a mile due east. Just follow the creek. Mrs. Chen's there and she's good people. Don't be afraid to ask her for help if you need it." Then he was gone, riding off on his sorrel mare, and Clara was left alone with her children in this cabin that felt simultaneously like salvation and like a trap she didn't yet understand. The day passed in a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. Claire kept herself busy cleaning the cabin, which was actually quite clean already, but gave her something to do, and sorting through the salvaged items Rowan had left on the porch. He'd been right about most of it being ruined, but there were a few treasures that survived. The tin box with their important papers, including the children's birth certificates and her marriage certificate to Thomas. The Bible, damp but readable. A small cloth doll that had been Emma's, somehow caught on a shrub and not buried in mud. Samuel's wooden horse that Thomas had carved. Clara washed these precious few items carefully, reverently, laying them in the sun to dry. These scraps of their old life, these small remnants of who they'd been before everything fell apart, felt more valuable than gold. The children, freed from the constant stress of survival, played outside under Clara's watchful eye. She heard laughter, actual laughter, for the first time in months as they chased each other around the clearing, Grace's delighted shrieks echoing off the cabin walls. Even Emma loosened up, allowing herself to be 7 years old instead of the miniature adult she'd been forced to become. In the afternoon, Clara washed their clothes in the creek, scrubbing them as best she could without soap, laying them on bushes to dry in the sun. She washed herself too, in the cold creek water that made her gasp, but also made her feel human again, removing 3 months of accumulated grime and desperation. When Rowan returned at sunset as promised, he found them all sitting on the porch step, clean and fed. Clara had figured out the cast iron pan and made a simple supper from the cabin stores, and looking more like a family than like refugees from disaster. He stopped his horse a few feet away, taking in the scene, and something soft crossed his face. "You look settled," he observed. "We're managing," Clara replied, which was the most optimistic thing she'd said in months. Rowan dismounted, reaching into his saddlebags. "Brought some things from the bunkhouse, extra blankets, another pillow, some soap I thought you might need. And Mrs. Chen sent over some clothes she thought might fit the children, hand-me-downs from the owner's grandchildren, who visit sometimes." Clara's throat tightened. Charity again, dressed up as casual generosity, but charity nonetheless. She should refuse, should maintain her dignity. But then she looked at her children in their worn, patched clothing and found she couldn't form the words. "That's very kind of Mrs. Chen," she managed. "She's excited to meet you tomorrow," Rowan said, carrying the items inside. "Fair warning, she's a bit overwhelming at first. Talks a lot, moves fast, has opinions about everything, but she's got a good heart, and she runs that ranch house like a general runs an army. You'll like her once you get past the initial shock." He helped Clara arrange the extra blankets on the bed, creating proper sleeping spaces for the children. He set up the second pillow, Clara had been planning to do without, and placed the soap on the shelf near the water bucket with the same casual efficiency he brought to everything. "There's one more thing," Rowan said when they were back outside, the children having gone to explore the creek one last time before dark. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket, weighing it in his hand with an expression that suggested he was unsure how to proceed. "This is awkward, but you mentioned having about $7 to your name. That's not enough to get by on, even with the cabin and work. So I talked to Mr. Blackwood, the ranch owner, and explained the situation. He agreed to advance you the first week's wages for the mending work. It's not much, maybe $10, but it should tide you over until you get properly established." He held out the pouch, and Clara stared at it like it was a snake. $10. Added to her 7, that was $17. More money than she'd had in her hand since Thomas died. It represented food, supplies, security. It represented survival. But it also represented debt, obligation, the potential for strings she couldn't see yet. "I can't accept that," she said, even as every practical part of her screamed that she was being a fool. "That's too much. I haven't even done any work yet." "It's an advance," Rowan said patiently. "You'll work it off. That's how wages work, Clara. The ranch pays you, you do the work. Mr. Blackwood's just starting the cycle a bit early to help you get on your feet. But what if I can't do the work? What if Mrs. Chen decides I'm not suitable? Then I'll owe the ranch money I can't repay." Rowan sighed, and for the first time she saw a flash of frustration cross his face. "Why are you fighting this so hard? Why is it so difficult for you to accept help?" "Because help always comes with a price." The words burst out before Clara could stop them. 3 months of fear and suspicion and painful lessons learned rushing to the surface. Because every time someone's offered help before, there were expectations, conditions, things I wasn't willing to give. So forgive me if I'm wary of a man I barely know offering me money and shelter and work without understanding what he expects in return. The frustration vanished from Rowan's expression, replaced by something that looked almost like pain. "I expect nothing," he said quietly, "except that you take care of those children and give them a better life than sleeping in a tent. That's all. No other conditions, no hidden expectations, no debt beyond honest work for honest pay." They stood there in the gathering darkness, the pouch of money between them like a physical representation of the trust Clara was so afraid to give. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But fear was a powerful thing, and she'd been afraid for so long she didn't know how to stop. "Mama?" Emma's voice came from behind them, and Clara turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway, Grace on her hip and Samuel holding her hand. "Is everything all right?" The sight of her children, clean, fed, safe in the doorway of a solid cabin instead of shivering in a collapsing tent, made the decision for her. She couldn't let pride or fear cost them this chance. She couldn't be so damaged by past experiences that she threw away their future. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Clara said, then turned back to Rowan and held out her hand for the pouch. "Thank you. For the advance. I'll work hard to earn it." Relief washed over Rowan's face. "I know you will," he said simply, placing the pouch in her palm. His hand was warm, calloused, steady. "Now get those children to bed. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day." That night, with her children tucked into the bed with proper blankets and full bellies, with money in her pocket and the promise of real work tomorrow, Clara lay on her makeshift pallet near the dying fire and tried to understand what was happening. She'd spent 3 months in survival mode, every decision driven by desperation, every day a battle, just to see the next sunrise. And now, suddenly, there was this cowboy, this stranger who'd appeared out of a storm, offering them a life. Not charity, he kept insisting, just help. Just the same kind of help his mother had received once, now being passed forward to someone else who needed it. Could she trust it? Could she trust him? Clara didn't know, but she knew she was tired of fighting alone, tired of watching her children suffer, tired of pretending she could do this all by herself. Maybe it was time to take a leap of faith. Maybe it was time to believe that not everyone had ulterior motives, that some people really did help simply because it was the right thing to do. Or maybe she was being a fool, and tomorrow would reveal the catch, the hidden price, the inevitable disappointment. But even if it did, at least tonight her children were safe and warm. At least tonight they'd gone to bed with full stomachs and clean clothes. At least tonight they'd had one good day. Sometimes, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, one good day was all you could ask for. And if tomorrow brought another good day and the day after that another, well, maybe eventually enough good days would add up to something like hope. The next morning arrived with clear skies and birdsong, the storm's violence erased by sunshine that poured through the cabin windows and painted everything gold. Clara woke to find Emma already up and trying to help Grace get dressed, and Samuel attempting to build up the fire with more enthusiasm than skill. They were playing house, she realized, acting out the roles of a normal family in a normal home, something they'd been denied for so long it had become a game of pretend. "Let me help with that, Sam," Clara said gently, taking over the fire before he could accidentally burn the cabin down. Within minutes, she had a proper blaze going and was mixing up cornmeal for breakfast when she heard hoofbeats outside. Rowan appeared in the doorway moments later, looking like he'd already been up for hours. Probably had been. Ranch work started before dawn and didn't end until after dark. "Morning," he said with that same calm friendliness he always showed. "Everyone ready to meet Mrs. Chen?" Clara's stomach flipped nervously. This was it, the real test. If Mrs. Chen didn't approve of her, if the housekeeper decided Clara wasn't suitable for the mending work, then all of this would fall apart. They'd be back where they started, but somehow even more desperate because now Clara had tasted what security could feel like and would have to watch it slip away. "Ready as we'll ever be," she said, smoothing down the borrowed shirt that she'd slept in, wishing desperately for something more presentable to wear. She looked like a vagrant, she knew. Thin, worn, dressed in men's clothing, her hair barely tamed into a braid. Not exactly the image of a respectable seamstress. But Rowan just smiled. "Mrs. Chen doesn't care much about appearances," he said, as if reading her mind. "She cares about whether you can sew a straight seam and whether you'll show up when you say you will. Everything else is just noise." The ride to the main ranch house was accomplished with all four of them on Rowan's patient mare, who seemed utterly unfazed by the unusual load. Clara held Grace in front of her while Emma and Samuel clung to Rowan's waist, and they made their way slowly along the creek path he'd indicated yesterday. The dusty spur ranch house appeared through the trees like something out of a storybook, a sprawling structure of dark wood and stone, 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch and actual glass windows that reflected the morning sun. It was easily the finest building Clara had seen since leaving Kansas City, and the sight of it made her acutely aware of how far she'd fallen in the world. Once, she'd lived in a house not entirely unlike this one. Once, she'd been respectable. "Don't let it intimidate you," Rowan murmured as he helped her dismount. "It's just a house. Big, but still just a house." Before Clara could respond, the front door banged open, and a small, formidable woman emerged onto the porch, like a general surveying her troops. She was Chinese, Clara realized with some surprise. Not common this far west, but not unheard of either. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her clothes were practical and spotless, and her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass as they assessed the newcomers. "So," Mrs. Chen said in accented but perfectly clear English, her hands on her hips, "this is the widow and children Rowan tells me about, the ones living in a tent, nearly died in the storm, yes?" Clara felt heat rush to her cheeks. Hearing her situation summarized so bluntly, so publicly, was mortifying. But she lifted her chin and met Mrs. Chen's gaze directly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Clara Jennings. These are my children, Emma, Samuel, and Grace." Mrs. Chen descended the porch steps with surprising speed for someone who looked to be in her 60s, circling Clara like a hawk examining prey. Clara fought the urge to fidget under that intense scrutiny, keeping her spine straight and her expression calm even though her heart was hammering. "Too thin," Mrs. Chen announced. "All of you, too thin. But that can be fixed. What cannot be fixed is lazy or dishonest. So let me ask you straight. Are you lazy? No, ma'am, Clara said firmly. Are you dishonest? No, ma'am. Can you sew? Yes, ma'am. I can sew, mend, darn, embroider, and do basic tailoring. My mother taught me from the time I was 5 years old. Good. Mrs. Chen turned to the children, who were pressed against Clara's legs, clearly intimidated by this whirlwind of a woman. Her expression softened slightly. You, oldest girl, you know how to wash dishes? Emma nodded mutely. You speak up when spoken to, child. Do you know how to wash dishes or not? Yes, ma'am, Emma squeaked. I can wash dishes. Then you can help in the kitchen while your mother works. Boy, you know how to gather eggs? Samuel's eyes widened. There's chickens? Of course there's chickens. What kind of ranch doesn't have chickens? Can you gather eggs without breaking them? I think so. Mrs. Chen's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. Then you will learn. And the little one, she stays with mother, yes? Too young for work. Yes, Clara said. Grace stays with me. Mrs. Chen nodded decisively. Good, then is settled. Come, I show you the workroom. Rowan, you stop hovering like nervous father. I will not eat them. Go do your actual job. Rowan caught Clara's eye, and she saw reassurance there, encouragement. You'll do fine, he said quietly. Then, louder to Mrs. Chen, I'm going. Try not to terrify them too much on the first day. I only terrify people who deserve terrifying, Mrs. Chen called back, already ushering Clara toward the house. These people need help, not terror. I know difference. And just like that, Clara found herself swept into the ranch house, through a spotless kitchen that smelled like fresh bread and coffee, down a hallway lined with photographs of stern-looking people, and into a sunlit room at the back of the house that was clearly set up for sewing work. A large table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by baskets overflowing with clothing that needed mending. A sewing machine, an actual treadle sewing machine, sat against one wall, and shelves held neat rows of thread, buttons, patches, and other supplies. It was a seamstress's dream, and Clara felt her fingers itch to start working. This is the mending room, Mrs. Chen said unnecessarily. As you see, there is much work. The ranch hands, they are hard on clothes, always ripping, tearing, losing buttons. The old seamstress, she left 6 months ago to get married, and since then the pile only grows bigger. Mr. Blackwood, he has been after me to find someone new, but good help is hard to find in Wyoming. She fixed Clara with that sharp gaze again. So here is what I offer. You mend what needs mending, alter what needs altering, and occasionally sew new things when required, shirts mostly, sometimes curtains or linens for the house. You work 4 days a week, mornings until afternoon. This gives you time for your own children and your own household. I pay $2 per week, plus you keep the cabin rent-free, plus meals while you work here. She paused. Is this acceptable? Clara's mind reeled. $2 a week was decent wages, not generous, but fair. Add in the free cabin and meals, and it was more than decent. It was the kind of steady income she'd been desperately seeking for 3 months and finding nowhere. It was security. It was survival. It was a future. It's more than acceptable, Mrs. Chen, Clara said, her voice thick. It's generous, thank you. Not generous, practical, Mrs. Chen corrected briskly. I need seamstress, you need work. Everyone benefits. Now, we see if you actually have the skills you claim or if you are all talk. She pulled a shirt from the nearest basket, a work shirt with a torn sleeve and missing buttons. Fix this. Show me your work. Clara took the shirt, examined the damage, and moved to the shelves to select thread and buttons. Her hands were shaking slightly from nerves, but once she sat at the table with needle and thread, once she made the first stitch, muscle memory took over. She'd been sewing since childhood, had spent countless hours at her mother's side learning every technique, every trick. Her mother had insisted she develop a skill she could rely on, a way to earn money if life ever got hard. Her mother had been wiser than Clara had realized at the time. She worked in silence, aware of Mrs. Chen watching her every move with those sharp eyes. She repaired the torn sleeve with tiny, nearly invisible stitches, reinforcing the weak spots. She replaced all the buttons, making sure they were sewn on securely with the thread wrapped properly. When she finished, she handed the shirt back to Mrs. Chen for inspection. The older woman examined it closely, turned it inside and out, tugged on the repair work, tested the buttons. Finally, she nodded. Good. Very good. Your mother taught you well. Relief flooded through Clara. Thank you, ma'am. Stop thanking me and start working, Mrs. Chen said, but her tone was less sharp now, almost approving. You have 3 months of backlog to catch up on. Emma, come. I show you the kitchen and you wash the breakfast dishes. Samuel, you come too. Learn where the chicken coop is. Little Grace, you stay with Mama, yes? I bring you some toys to play with. And just like that, Clara found herself employed, her children occupied with age-appropriate tasks, and the overwhelming pile of mending transforming from terrifying to merely daunting. She worked steadily through the morning, developing a rhythm, sorting the items by urgency and type of repair needed. Mrs. Chen came and went, bringing coffee at one point, lunch at midday, a hearty stew with fresh bread that Clara ate gratefully while Grace napped on a blanket in the corner. Emma reported that the kitchen work wasn't too hard and that Mrs. Chen had let her taste the cookies that were cooling. Samuel came back with a basket of eggs, beaming with pride at not having broken a single one. It felt almost surreal, this sudden shift from desperate survival to something that resembled normal life. Claire kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to laugh and tell her it was all a joke, that she couldn't really have this job, this cabin, this chance. But the hours passed and nothing terrible happened. She just worked, and her children helped, and Mrs. Chen approved of their efforts without being effusive about it. When the afternoon light started to fade, Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway. Enough for today, she announced. You have worked well. Come back Thursday morning, same time. I will have more for you. Clara gathered her children and their few belongings, feeling dazed by how well the day had gone. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen pressed a bundle into her hands. What's this? Clara asked. Clothes, for you and the children. I told you, hand-me-downs from Mr. Blackwood's grandchildren who visit sometimes, and some things from the missionary barrel that don't fit anyone else. Is not charity, she added sharply before Clara could protest, is practicality. You cannot work in men's clothes that fall off. You need proper dress. The children need proper clothes. You take these, you wash them, you alter them to fit if needed. This is sensible, yes? Yes, Clara whispered. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Stop thanking me, Mrs. Chen said, but her eyes were gentler now. You just work hard and take care of those babies. That is thanks enough. Rowan was waiting outside to take them back to the cabin, and the ride back was filled with the children's chatter about their day, the chickens, the kitchen, the cookies, all of it spilling out in an excited tumble. Clara held the bundle of clothes and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. At the cabin, as Rowan helped them down from the horse, Clara found her voice. Rowan, I don't know how to express what this means to us. The job, the cabin, all of it. You've given us back our lives. Rowan looked uncomfortable again with the gratitude. I told you, Clara, I'm just passing forward what was done for my mother once. Besides, you earned that job yourself. Mrs. Chen doesn't hire people out of pity. She hired you because you're good at what you do. But you made it possible, Clara insisted. You brought us here, introduced us, gave us the chance. That matters. Then make the most of it, Rowan said simply. Build a good life for those children. That's all the thanks I need. He tipped his hat. I'll check on you tomorrow. Make sure you have everything you need. For tonight, rest. You've earned it. He rode off into the gathering dusk, and Clara stood watching him go, this mysterious cowboy who had appeared in a storm and somehow transformed everything. She didn't understand him, didn't understand what drove him to help strangers, what made him so determined to see them settled and safe, what he really wanted from all of this. But maybe, Clara thought as she herded her children inside to explore the bundle of clothes, maybe she didn't need to understand it all right now. Maybe it was enough to accept the help, do the work, and take each day as it came. Maybe for once in her life, she could just let someone be kind without interrogating their motives or waiting for the inevitable betrayal. Maybe this time, things really could be different. That night, her children fell asleep in their new-to-them clothes, full bellies and clean skin, surrounded by the solid walls of the cabin that was starting to feel like home. And Clara lay awake, listening to them breathe, feeling the weight of the $2 she'd earned today tucked safely in the tin box under the bed, and allowed herself to believe that they were going to be all right. They were going to survive this. More than survive. They were going to live again. And it was all because of one cowboy who had refused to ride past a struggling family, who had seen their need and done something about it, who had given them back not just shelter, but dignity. Clara fell asleep with a prayer of gratitude on her lips and the sound of hope beating steadily in her chest, quiet but persistent as a heartbeat, promising that better days were coming if she just had the courage to reach for them. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Clara hadn't experienced since before Thomas died. A predictable, steady pattern of days that didn't revolve around crisis or desperation. She woke each morning to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows instead of wind tearing at canvas. She dressed her children in proper clothes that fit, clothes that weren't held together by patches and prayers. She made breakfast from supplies that didn't have to be rationed down to the last crumb. 4 mornings a week, she walked the mile to the ranch house with her children, Grace riding on her hip and the older two skipping ahead, their voices bright with the kind of careless joy that children should always have, but that hers had been denied for so long. Mrs. Chen would be waiting on the porch, imperious and efficient, already planning the day's tasks with the precision of a military campaign. The work itself was satisfying in a way Clara hadn't expected. There was something deeply peaceful about sitting at that big table in the sunny workroom, needle and thread in hand, transforming torn and worn clothing back into serviceable garments. Each repaired seam, each replaced button, each carefully darned sock represented order restored, problem solved, usefulness returned to things that had seemed beyond saving. Sometimes Clara wondered if she saw herself in those torn shirts and worn pants, something damaged that could be mended with patience and care, something that could be made whole again if someone just took the time to work at it, stitch by careful stitch. Mrs. Chen was a demanding employer, but a fair one, quick to point out mistakes, but equally quick to praise work well done. She seemed to have endless energy despite her age, constantly in motion, overseeing not just Clara's work, but the entire household operation with the efficiency of a woman who had been running things for so long she could do it in her sleep. Emma thrived in the kitchen, learning from Mrs. Chen with the eager attention of a child starved for knowledge and purpose. The older woman taught her how to knead bread, how to season soup, how to tell when meat was properly cooked. Emma absorbed it all with a seriousness that was both endearing and heartbreaking, as if she understood that these skills might someday mean the difference between survival and starvation. Samuel had found his calling with the chickens, developing a rapport with the birds that amused everyone who witnessed it. He'd named them all, ridiculous names like General Feathers and Lady Cluckington, and talked to them as he gathered eggs, treating each one like a personal friend. The ranch hands teased him gently about it, but Clara could see the affection in their eyes when they watched her son carefully carrying his egg basket, his thin chest puffed out with pride at being trusted with important work. And Grace, still too young for real tasks, had been adopted by the entire household as a kind of communal pet. She played in the workroom while Clara sewed, sometimes napping on the blanket Mrs. Chen had provided, sometimes playing with the wooden toys that mysteriously appeared, gifts from ranch hands who claimed to have whittled them during slow evenings, but who turned bashful when Clara tried to thank them. But it was Rowan whose presence shaped their days in ways both obvious and subtle, though Clara was trying very hard not to think too much about what that meant. He came by the cabin most evenings, usually with some practical excuse, checking that the roof was sound, bringing firewood he claimed was extra from the bunkhouse supply, fixing the shutter that had started to hang crooked. Always there was a reason, a justification for the visit that had nothing to do with simply wanting to see them. Clara pretended to believe these excuses, just as Rowan pretended they were true, and they maintained this careful fiction because the alternative, acknowledging that he was visiting simply because he wanted to, because he cared about them, because something was growing between them that neither was quite ready to name, was too dangerous to examine directly. The children had no such reservations. They adored Rowan with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of young people who recognize genuine kindness when they encountered it. Samuel especially had attached himself to the foreman with an intensity that worried Clara sometimes. The boy followed Rowan around whenever possible, pestering him with questions about horses and cattle and ranch work, absorbing every word like it was gospel truth handed down from on high. One evening in late September, as the Wyoming summer was finally surrendering to autumn's cooler embrace, Rowan arrived at the cabin with his usual excuse about checking something or other, but this time he had a surprise that made Samuel actually shriek with excitement. "You remember that mare that foaled back in June?" Rowan asked, and Samuel nodded so vigorously Clara worried he'd hurt his neck. "Well, Mr. Blackwood decided the colt needs someone to gentle him proper, get him used to being handled before we start serious training. Thought maybe you'd like to help with that, Sam, if your mother agrees, of course." Samuel's eyes went so wide Clara could see white all around the irises. "Really? You mean it? I could help with a real horse?" "Hold on," Clara interjected, her maternal instincts immediately raising alarm. "Samuel's 5 years old. Isn't that too young to be working with horses? What if he gets hurt?" "I'll be with him the whole time," Rowan assured her, his tone calm and reasonable. "We're just teaching the colt to accept a halter, to let us touch him, basic gentle handling, nothing dangerous. But it's important work, and Sam here strikes me as someone who'd be good at it. Patient, kind, not prone to sudden movements that would spook the animal." He looked at Samuel with an expression of such genuine respect that Clara felt something twist in her chest. "What do you say, son? Think you can handle that responsibility?" Samuel was practically vibrating with eagerness, but he turned to Clara with a pleading expression that she had absolutely no defense against. "Please, Mama, I'll be so careful, I promise. I'll do everything Rowan says exactly right. Please." Clara looked from her son's desperate hope to Rowan's steady confidence and felt herself giving in despite her better judgment. "All right," she said slowly, "but at the first sign of danger, the first moment I think it's not safe, this arrangement ends. Understood?" "Understood," Rowan agreed solemnly, while Samuel launched himself at Clara in a hug so fierce it nearly knocked her over. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," the boy babbled against her shoulder. "I'll be so good, Mama. You'll see. I'll be the best horse helper ever." Watching Samuel's joy, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. This was what childhood should look like. Excitement over new experiences, trust in adults who promise to keep you safe, hope for tomorrow. For so long, her children had lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing if they'd eat that day, never certain they'd survive the night. And now, slowly, they were remembering how to be children again. "There's something else," Rowan said, and Clara turned her attention back to him. He looked uncharacteristically uncertain, his hat in his hands, his weight shifting slightly. "There's a church social in Green River next Saturday evening. Music, dancing, food. The whole town turns out for it. I was wondering if you'd like to go. With me. All of you," he added quickly. "The children too, of course. It'd be good for them to meet other families, start feeling like part of the community." Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. A skip, followed by a flutter, followed by a plunge into her stomach. A church social. With Rowan. That was courting. That was the kind of thing a man did when he was interested in a woman as more than just someone he was helping out of Christian charity. "I don't know," she said carefully. "People will talk." "People are already talking," Rowan countered. "Widow living alone in a cabin with 3 children, foreman visiting most evenings, mysterious arrangement with the ranch. Believe me, Green River's had plenty to gossip about already. Might as well give them something worth gossiping over." "But I don't have anything suitable to wear to a social," Clara protested, grasping for objections because the alternative was admitting that she wanted to go. That the idea of spending an evening with Rowan doing something that wasn't related to survival or practicality made her feel something she'd thought was dead and buried with Thomas. "Mrs. Chen mentioned she's got a dress she thinks would fit you," Rowan said, and Clara realized this had been planned, discussed, arranged between the two of them before he ever came to ask her. The thought should have annoyed her, people making decisions about her life, but instead it felt oddly touching. They'd thought about her, cared enough to plan this, wanted to see her have something nice. "Mama, can we go?" Emma asked, appearing in the doorway where she'd clearly been eavesdropping. "There'll be other children there? And music?" "I've never been to a real dance," Samuel added, abandoning all pretense that he hadn't been listening to. "Papa always said he'd take us when we got settled, but then He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all knew how that story ended. Clara looked at her children's hopeful faces, at Rowan's careful expression that tried to hide how much her answer mattered to him, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. "All right," she said softly. "We'll go. Thank you for the invitation." The smile that broke across Rowan's face was like sunrise, bright and warm and transformative. "Good," he said simply. "That's real good. I'll come by Saturday around 6 to fetch you all." After he left, Emma immediately began pestering Clara about what they'd wear, what the dancing would be like, whether there'd be cake. Samuel wanted to know if there'd be other boys his age, if they'd like him, if they'd think it was impressive that he was helping with a horse. Even Grace seemed to sense the excitement, dancing around the cabin in circles while singing nonsense songs. Clara tried to share their enthusiasm, but underneath the anticipation was a current of anxiety she couldn't quite suppress. She'd been a widow for only 4 months. Was it too soon to be seen in public with another man? What would people think? Would they judge her, whisper that she'd dishonored Thomas's memory, spread rumors that she'd been involved with Rowan even before her husband died? That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat by the fire and let herself think about Thomas properly for the first time in weeks. She'd been so focused on survival, then on adjusting to their new circumstances, that she'd pushed her grief aside, packed it away in some corner of her mind where it wouldn't interfere with the practical necessities of keeping her children alive. But now, in the quiet darkness, she let herself remember. Thomas's laugh, deep and genuine, the way he'd sing off key while doing chores, his absolute certainty that they were going to build something wonderful out west, that their future was bright and boundless, his gentleness with the children, his ambitious plans, his fundamental goodness. She'd loved him. She still loved him, in the way you love someone who shaped your life and gave you your children and then left a Thomas-shaped hole in the world when he departed. But that love was complicated now by the reality of what had come after, the desperate struggle to survive, the moments when she'd been angry at him for dying, for leaving her alone, for dragging them out west to pursue his dreams, and then abandoning her to deal with the nightmare those dreams became. Was it a betrayal to feel something for Rowan? To look forward to seeing him each evening, to notice the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, to feel safe in his presence in a way she hadn't felt safe in months? Was it wrong to be attracted to his quiet strength, his steady reliability, the way he treated her children with genuine affection rather than obligation? Clara didn't know. She suspected Thomas, generous soul that he'd been, would have wanted her to find happiness again, would have wanted their children to have a father figure in their lives. But knowing what Thomas would have wanted and allowing herself to pursue it were two very different things. Saturday arrived faster than Clara expected, marked by a flurry of preparation that took over the entire cabin. Mrs. Chen had indeed provided a dress, a simple calico in deep blue with cream-colored buttons, slightly worn but clean and well-maintained. It was too large in some places and too small in others, but Clara had the skills to alter it, working late into the night by firelight to take it in at the waist, let out the hem, adjust the sleeves. When she finally tried on the finished product, Emma gasped. "Mama, you look so pretty!" Clara examined herself in the small, cracked mirror that hung near the door, the only mirror in the cabin. The woman looking back at her was thinner than she remembered, her face more angular, her eyes older. But the dress fit well, and with her hair washed and properly braided, she looked almost like her old self. Almost like a woman who might reasonably attend a social function rather than a desperate widow living in a tent. The children were equally transformed. Mrs. Chen had provided clothes for them too, a dress for Emma in yellow cotton that made her look suddenly grown up, proper pants and a shirt for Samuel that weren't patched or too large, a tiny dress for Grace with ruffles at the hem that made the little girl twirl with delight. When Rowan arrived at 6 o'clock as promised, Clara saw his eyes widen slightly as he took them all in. "Well," he said after a moment, "don't you all look fine?" He'd clearly made an effort himself. His shirt was clean and pressed, his pants free of the dust and dirt that usually marked his workdays, his boots polished, his hair still damp from washing. He'd even shaved, revealing a strong jawline that Clara realized she'd never properly seen beneath the usual stubble. The ride into Green River took about 40 minutes, all of them squeezed onto Rowan's mare and a second horse he'd borrowed for the occasion. Samuel rode with Rowan, chattering excitedly about the horse training they'd been doing. Emma rode with Clara, uncharacteristically quiet, nervous about meeting other children after so long in isolation. Grace dozed in Clara's arms, worn out from the excitement of the day. Green River on a Saturday evening was transformed from the dusty, rough town Clara remembered from her desperate days seeking work. Lanterns hung from storefronts and trees, casting a warm glow over the main street. The church, a modest white building with a simple steeple, had its doors thrown open, and music spilled out into the evening air. People dressed in their Sunday best walked in groups toward the church, calling greetings to neighbors, laughing at shared jokes. Clara felt her stomach clench with anxiety. These people knew her, or knew of her, the desperate widow with 3 children who'd been living in a tent on the outskirts of town. They'd seen her at her lowest, watched her struggle and fail to find work, probably gossiped about her situation over dinner tables and at other social gatherings. What would they think seeing her here now, dressed properly, arriving with Rowan Tate, who was well respected in the community? "Hey," Rowan said softly, touching her arm gently. "You're doing that thing where you worry about what people think. Stop it. You have as much right to be here as anyone." "Easy for you to say," Clara murmured. "You weren't the one they all watched falling apart." "No," Rowan agreed, "but I was the one everyone gossiped about when my mother died, and I was living rough, doing odd jobs, sleeping in barns. People love to talk, Clara, but they also love seeing someone rise back up. Give them that story instead of the tragedy they've been telling. Show them you're not defeated." The conviction in his voice steadied her. Clara took a breath, adjusted Grace on her hip, and walked toward the church with her head high and her children beside her. The social was held in the church hall attached to the main building, a large room with wooden floors perfect for dancing, long tables laden with food contributed by various families, and a small stage where 3 musicians were already warming up with fiddle, guitar, and banjo. The room was crowded with people Clara vaguely recognized, ranch families from the surrounding area, townspeople, the merchants she'd approached during her desperate job search. Several heads turned when they entered. Clara felt the weight of curious stares, heard the whispers that immediately started. But before her anxiety could fully take hold, Mrs. Chen materialized at her elbow, like a protective guardian. "You look good," the older woman announced loudly enough for nearby people to hear. "The dress fits perfect. Yes, I told you it would. Come, I introduce you properly to people. Not as desperate widow, but as my seamstress who does excellent work." And just like that, Clara found herself being paraded around the room by Mrs. Chen, who introduced her to various townspeople with the kind of authority that brooked no judgment or gossip. This was Mrs. Chen's employee, her tone implied, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with her directly. Several women Clara had previously approached for work now greeted her with cautious friendliness, perhaps remembering that they'd turned her away in her time of need and feeling awkward about it. The Reverend's wife was particularly effusive, gushing about how wonderful it was that Clara had found stable employment, how good it was for the children to be properly settled. Clara smiled and nodded and said the right things, all while feeling like she was playing a role in some elaborate theater production. This polite, grateful version of herself felt distant from the desperate, angry woman who'd lived in that tent, as if that Clara had been someone else entirely. The children, meanwhile, had been absorbed into various groups. Emma had been claimed by a cluster of girls near her age who were giggling over something by the food table. Samuel had found several boys who were staging an elaborate game involving pretending the floor was lava and the chairs were safe islands. Grace had been scooped up by a kindly grandmother type who was cooing over her ruffled dress and feeding her small pieces of cookie. Rowan stayed nearby, not hovering exactly, but present, a solid, steady presence that Clara found herself unconsciously drifting toward whenever the social interactions became overwhelming. He seemed to know half the people in the room, exchanging easy greetings with ranchers, joking with the merchants, respectfully nodding to the town's more prominent citizens. When the music started in earnest, the dance floor began to fill with couples. Clara watched from the sidelines, her foot tapping unconsciously to the lively fiddle tune. It had been so long since she'd danced, since she'd done anything purely for enjoyment rather than survival. The last time had been at a harvest festival back in Kansas City, before Thomas had gotten the idea to move west, before everything had fallen apart. Dance with me, Rowan said beside her, and Clara startled. She'd been so lost in memory she hadn't noticed him approaching. I don't know if I should, Clara said hesitantly. People are already talking. Let them talk, Rowan interrupted. You said yourself they're already gossiping. Might as well give them something worth their breath. He held out his hand, patient, not pushing, just offering. One dance, Clara. Just want one. When's the last time you did something just because it made you happy? Clara couldn't remember. Happiness had been so far down her list of priorities for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. But looking at Rowan's outstretched hand, at the hope in his eyes, at the people swirling around the dance floor who seemed to be having the time of their lives, she found herself nodding. All right, she said softly. One dance. His hand closed around hers, warm and calloused and steady, and he led her onto the dance floor just as the fiddle player launched into a waltz. Clara had a moment of panic. She didn't remember how to do this, hadn't danced in years, was going to embarrass herself. But then Rowan's other hand settled at her waist, and he was guiding her into the steps with a confidence that made it easy to follow. They moved awkwardly at first, Clara stumbling over her own feet, hyper-aware of his hand at her waist, of how close they were, of the people watching from the sidelines. But Rowan just smiled at her, encouraging and gentle, and slowly she relaxed into the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Around and around the floor, while the fiddles sang and the other couples swirled nearby. You're doing fine, Rowan murmured. Just relax and trust me to lead. Trust. Such a small word for such an enormous ask. But Clara found that she did trust him. This man who'd pulled them from a storm, who'd given them shelter and work, who visited their cabin each evening with transparent excuses just to check that they were all right. She trusted him in a way she hadn't trusted anyone in a very long time. The waltz ended and another began, and they kept dancing. Clara stopped worrying about the watching eyes, stopped caring what people might say. For these few minutes, she let herself simply be, not a desperate widow, not a struggling mother, not a woman haunted by loss and failure. Just Clara, dancing with a good man under lantern light while music filled the air. When they finally left the floor, breathless and smiling, Clara felt lighter than she had in months. Emma ran up immediately, her eyes shining. Mama, you looked so beautiful out there, like a princess. Did I? Clara laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. I felt more like a clumsy farm girl who'd forgotten how to dance. You looked perfect, Rowan said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice made Clara's breath catch. They spent the rest of the evening in comfortable company, eating the potluck food, watching the children play, occasionally venturing onto the dance floor for another turn. Clara found herself actually enjoying the social interactions, laughing at jokes, sharing stories with other women about the trials of motherhood, accepting compliments on her sewing work from people who'd heard about it from Mrs. Chen. It felt normal, ordinary, like being part of a community again instead of an outsider looking in, and that feeling was headier than any wine could have been. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their children for the journey home, Rowan helped Clara collect her 3. Grace asleep and draped over Clara's shoulder, Samuel practically vibrating with excitement from playing with other children, Emma clutching a ribbon one of her new friends had given her. Did you have a good time? Rowan asked as they walked toward where the horses were tethered. I did, Clara admitted, surprised by how true it was. Thank you for bringing us. The children needed this, to feel normal, to have fun, to make friends, and She paused, searching for words. I needed it too, I think. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be something other than afraid or desperate. You're a lot more than that, Rowan said firmly. You're strong, Clara, strongest person I know, truth be told. What you've survived, what you've managed to build for those kids, that takes a kind of courage most people never have to find in themselves. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I don't feel strong. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding it together, like everything could fall apart again at any moment. That's what makes you strong, Rowan countered, knowing it could all fall apart and keeping going anyway. That's not weakness, Clara. That's warrior-level strength. They rode home through the cool autumn night, the children drowsing in their arms, the horses moving at an easy walk that made no demands. Clara found herself leaning slightly against Rowan's shoulder, too tired and content to worry about propriety. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns older than memory, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "Rowan," Clara said softly, not wanting to wake the children, "why did you really ask me to the social tonight? And don't tell me it was just for the children's benefit." She felt him tense slightly, then relax. "Because I wanted to," he said simply. "Because I wanted to spend time with you doing something that wasn't work or worry. Because I think you're remarkable, and I wanted everyone in Green River to see you the way I see you. Not as someone to be pitied, but as someone to be admired." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. "That sounds dangerously close to courting, Mr. Tate." "Maybe it is," Rowan said quietly. "Would that be such a terrible thing?" "Would it?" Clara examined her feelings as carefully as she might examine a torn seam, looking for the weak spots, the places that might unravel under pressure. She found fear, yes, the fear of trusting someone again, of opening her heart only to have it broken when he left or died, or revealed himself to be something other than what he seemed. But she also found something else: attraction, genuine and undeniable. The flutter she felt when she saw him riding up to the cabin each evening, the way her day felt more complete when he was part of it, the growing certainty that what she felt for him was developing into something deeper than gratitude or friendship. "It's only been 4 months since Thomas died," she said finally. "People will say it's too soon, that I'm dishonoring his memory." "Thomas is dead," Rowan said, not unkindly but bluntly. "And you're alive. You've got a whole life ahead of you, Clara. You think he'd want you to spend it alone out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to his memory?" "I don't know what he'd want," Clara admitted. "We never talked about it. We were young, we thought we had forever. We didn't plan for him dying and leaving me alone with 3 children and no money and no prospects." "Then maybe it's time to stop worrying about what the dead would want and start thinking about what you want," Rowan suggested gently. "What do you want, Clara?" The question hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying. What did she want? For months, Clara had been so focused on basic survival that she'd forgotten she was allowed to want anything beyond food and shelter. But now, with her children safe and fed and sleeping peacefully in her arms, with steady work and a solid roof over their heads, she found she could think beyond mere survival to something that looked almost like happiness. "I want my children to be safe and healthy and happy," she said slowly. "I want them to grow up feeling secure, knowing they're loved. I want Emma to keep that spark of intelligence and curiosity. I want Samuel to stay gentle and kind. I want Grace to never remember what it felt like to go to bed hungry." "Those are good wants," Rowan said. "What do you want for yourself?" Clara took a shaky breath. "I want to feel like I'm living again instead of just surviving. I want to go to bed at night without constantly waiting for the next disaster. I want to—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want to believe that good things can happen to me, that not everyone I care about will leave or die or disappoint me." "I'm not going anywhere," Rowan said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "And I don't plan on dying anytime soon. And Clara, I can promise you right now, I will do everything in my power never to disappoint you." "You can't promise that," Clara protested. "No one can promise that." "Then let me promise this instead. I will try, every single day, to be the kind of man you and those children deserve. I will show up when I say I will. I will be honest even when the truth is hard. I will put your needs and your children's needs above my own comfort. And if I fail, when I fail, because everyone fails sometimes, I will own it and work to do better." Clara felt something crack open in her chest, some protective wall she'd built around her heart after Thomas's death. "That's a big promise." "I'm a man who keeps his promises," Rowan said simply, "so I don't make them lightly." They reached the cabin just then, the familiar shape of it solid and welcoming in the darkness. Rowan helped Clara dismount, carefully transferring sleeping children without waking them. Together they got the little ones inside and into bed, moving around each other with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity. When all 3 children were tucked in and breathing deeply, Clara walked Rowan back to the door. They stood there in the threshold, neither quite ready to say goodnight, the air between them charged with possibility. "Thank you," Clara said finally, "for tonight, for everything, for seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. You saved yourself, Rowan corrected. I just gave you some tools to work with. Then thank you for the tools. Clara hesitated, then made a decision. She rose up on her toes and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to Rowan's cheek. Good night, Rowan. She saw surprise flash across his face, followed by something that looked like wonder. His hand came up to touch the spot where her lips had been, as if confirming it had really happened. Good night, Clara, he said softly. Then, with a visible reluctance, he stepped off the porch and walked toward his horse. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him ride away, her fingers pressed to her own lips, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. She'd just crossed a line, she realized. That kiss, innocent as it had been, represented an acknowledgement that something was happening between them, something that went beyond gratitude or friendship or the simple kindness of one person helping another. She was falling for Rowan Tate. Maybe had already fallen, truth be told. And the terrifying, exhilarating truth was that she thought maybe, possibly, he was falling for her too. The autumn weeks progressed in a golden haze of work and growing attachment. Clara's skills as a seamstress became well known in Green River, and soon people were bringing their mending directly to her at the cabin, willing to pay for quality work. The extra income, combined with her wages from the ranch, meant she could actually save money, building a small cushion against future emergencies that made her breathe easier at night. Samuel's work with the colt progressed beautifully. The young horse, whom Samuel had immediately named Thunder despite the animal's gentle temperament, followed the boy around like a puppy, nuzzling his pockets for treats and whickering with pleasure when Samuel appeared. Watching her son's confidence grow, seeing him develop a skill that might serve him well in this ranching country, filled Clara with fierce maternal pride. Emma had been invited to attend the small school that met in the back room of the general store 3 days a week. Clara couldn't quite afford the tuition, but Mrs. Chen had somehow arranged for it to be sponsored by an anonymous benefactor, whom Clara strongly suspected was either Rowan or Mrs. Chen herself. Emma was thriving there, soaking up knowledge like a sponge, coming home each day with stories about what she'd learned. And Rowan continued his evening visits, though now they dropped the pretense of checking repairs or bringing supplies. He came because he wanted to see them, because Clara looked forward to his arrival, to the way his presence made the cabin feel complete, because the children lit up when they heard his horse approaching, because somewhere along the way they'd become something that looked very much like a family. One evening in late October, as the first real cold snap of autumn had them all huddled near the fire, Rowan arrived with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Clara asked as he handed it to her. "Early Christmas present," Rowan said, looking almost shy. "Well, not really Christmas, more of a because I saw it and thought of you present." Clara unwrapped it carefully, aware of the children crowding around to see. Inside was a length of deep red wool, beautiful quality, soft and warm, enough to make a shawl or maybe a dress if she was careful with the cutting. "Rowan," she breathed, "this must have cost a fortune." "It was a good price," he said, which Clara suspected was a lie. "And you've been wearing the same dress for weeks now. Figured you could use something new, something that's yours, not a hand-me-down or a borrowed thing." The thoughtfulness of it, the fact that he'd noticed what she wore, that he'd thought about what she might need or want, made Clara's eyes sting with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll make something beautiful with it," Rowan suggested. "Say you'll wear it to the church social next month. Say—" He hesitated, then pushed forward with visible determination. "Say you'll wear it when I take you to dinner at the hotel in Green River, just the two of us. An actual courting dinner, properly done." The children gasped with excitement. "Are you asking Mama on a date?" Emma squealed. "I am, Rowan confirmed, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "If she'll have me." Clara looked at this man who'd saved them from a storm, and then kept saving them, day after day, in ways both large and small. This man who made her laugh, who treated her children with genuine affection, who saw her not as a burden or a charity case, but as someone worthy of respect and care. This man who made her feel alive again in ways she'd thought impossible after Thomas's death. "Yes," she said softly, then louder. "Yes, I'll have you. I'd be honored to have dinner with you." The smile that broke across Rowan's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, bright and warm and transformative. The children cheered, Samuel launching himself at Rowan in an exuberant hug that nearly knocked the man over, Emma dancing around the cabin with the red wool held against her chest, Grace clapping her hands and giggling without understanding what was happening but catching the joy anyway. And Clara stood there holding that beautiful red wool, feeling her heart expand with something that felt dangerously, wonderfully like hope, mixed with affection, mixed with the early stirrings of what might become love if she gave it time and room to grow. She'd been so afraid for so long, afraid of starving, afraid of failing her children, afraid of trusting again, afraid of wanting more than mere survival. But maybe it was time to stop being afraid. Maybe it was time to embrace the second chance that had quite literally ridden up to her tent in the middle of a storm. Maybe it was time to believe that happy endings weren't just for other people, but for her too. The dinner at the Green River Hotel happened on a Saturday evening in early November, when the Wyoming air had turned crisp enough that breath made clouds, and the promise of winter hung heavy in the sky. Clara had spent the better part of 2 weeks working on a dress from Rowan's red wool, staying up late by lamplight to get every seam perfect, every detail just right. She'd styled it simply: high collar, fitted bodice, full skirt that swayed when she walked. But the color transformed it into something special, something that made her feel beautiful in a way she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Mrs. Chen had agreed to watch the children for the evening, an arrangement that had involved much negotiation and final acceptance on Clara's part. The older woman had been surprisingly gentle about it, saying only that Clara deserved an evening to herself, that the children would be perfectly safe, and that anyone who suggested otherwise could take their opinions directly to her if they dared. Rowan arrived at the cabin precisely at 6, dressed in what Clara suspected were his finest clothes: dark pants, a pressed white shirt, a vest that looked new, and a string tie that he kept adjusting nervously. His hair was slicked back with pomade, his boots polished to a shine, and he carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that he must have ridden all over creation to find. "You look beautiful," he said when Clara opened the door, and the raw honesty in his voice made her blush. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, accepting the flowers with hands that trembled slightly. This was real, she realized. This was happening. She was going on an actual courting dinner with a man who wasn't Thomas, and the weight of that reality was both exhilarating and terrifying. The children had their own opinions about the evening, expressed with the blunt honesty of youth. Emma kept circling Clara, examining the dress from every angle and declaring it the most beautiful thing ever. Samuel wanted to know why Rowan was wearing fancy clothes and whether there would be dessert. Grace simply held up her arms to be picked up by Rowan, which he did without hesitation, settling the little girl on his hip as naturally as if she were his own. "You be good for Mrs. Chen," Clara instructed her children, kissing each of them goodbye with a mother's mixture of love and anxiety about leaving them. "Listen to what she says, help with the dishes, and get to bed on time." "We will, Mama," Emma promised solemnly. "You have fun with Rowan. Don't worry about us." The fact that her 8-year-old daughter was reassuring her about going on a date was both amusing and slightly mortifying, but Clara accepted the sentiment with grace. She'd worried so much about her children for so long that having them worry about her for a change felt oddly touching. The ride into Green River took about 30 minutes, and unlike their previous journey to the church social, this time it was just the two of them. Clara rode behind Rowan on his sorrel mare, her arms around his waist, acutely aware of every point of contact between them. They talked easily about inconsequential things: the weather turning colder, the ranch preparing for winter, the new family that had moved into town and opened a bakery. But beneath the casual conversation ran a current of nervous energy, anticipation of what this evening meant, where it might lead. The Green River Hotel was the finest establishment in town, a 2-story building with actual glass windows and a dining room that served meals to travelers and locals alike. Clara had walked past it many times during her desperate months, but had never imagined setting foot inside. The place represented a world she'd thought forever closed to her, the world of people who had money, security, places to belong. Rowan helped her dismount, offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and escorted her through the front door like she was royalty rather than a widow who'd been living in a tent just months ago. The dining room was warm and inviting, lit by oil lamps that cast a golden glow over white tablecloths and real china plates. Several tables were occupied by other diners, ranchers and their wives, a few traveling salesmen, the bank manager with his family. Heads turned when Clara and Rowan entered, and Clara felt the familiar weight of curious stares. "Just breathe," Rowan murmured near her ear. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." They were seated at a corner table that offered a measure of privacy while still allowing them to see the rest of the room. The proprietor, a heavy-set man named Mr. Ferguson, whom Clara vaguely recognized, greeted Rowan warmly and treated Clara with the kind of respectful courtesy that suggested he'd been instructed to do so, possibly by Mrs. Chen or Rowan himself. "The special tonight is roast beef with potatoes and carrots," Mr. Ferguson announced. "We've also got chicken and dumplings and a nice pork roast. To drink, we have coffee, tea, or lemonade." Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd been offered actual choices about food rather than simply eating whatever was available or going without. The menu seemed impossibly luxurious: real meat, multiple options, side dishes that didn't come from a sack of cornmeal. Her throat tightened with emotion she tried to hide. "The roast beef sounds wonderful," she managed. "Make that 2, Rowan added, "and coffee for both of us." When Mr. Ferguson departed to place their order, Clara looked around the dining room with fresh eyes. She recognized several people now: the dry goods merchant who'd bought her wedding ring and then forgotten his promise to help feed her children, the banker who'd refused her request for a small loan, the Reverend's wife who'd expressed concern about Clara's situation but hadn't actually offered any concrete assistance. These were people who'd seen her at her lowest, who'd witnessed her desperation and done nothing meaningful to help. "Stop," Rowan said gently, and Clara realized her hands were clenched on the tablecloth. "I can see you remembering all the times people failed you. Don't let them take this evening from you. Don't give them that power." "It's hard not to think about it," Clara admitted quietly. "Being here, seeing them, it reminds me of going door to door begging for work, for help, for anything, and being turned away again and again." "I know," Rowan said. "But Clara, look at where you are now. You're not begging anymore. You're here as a paying customer, wearing a dress you made with your own skilled hands, having earned your place through hard work and determination. You're not the desperate woman they remember. You're something stronger, something that survived what would have broken most people." Clara met his eyes and saw absolute conviction there, absolute belief in her. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, being seen that way, being believed in with such certainty. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as a failure, as someone who'd let her children down, that accepting Rowan's version of events required a fundamental shift in how she understood her own story. "How do you do that?" she asked softly. "Do what?" "Make me believe I'm better than I think I am." Rowan reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. The gesture was intimate enough to draw more glances from nearby tables, but Clara found she didn't care. Let them look. Let them whisper. She was done living her life according to other people's judgments. "I don't make you believe anything," Rowan said. "I just reflect back what's already there. You're remarkable, Clara Jennings. You just forgot it for a while." Their food arrived before Clara could formulate a response to that statement, and for several minutes they ate in comfortable silence. The roast beef was tender and flavorful, the potatoes creamy with butter, the carrots cooked to perfection. It was without question the finest meal Clara had eaten since leaving Kansas City, and she found herself savoring every bite, making it last as long as possible. "Tell me about Thomas," Rowan said suddenly, and Clara looked up in surprise. "Why would you want to know about my dead husband on our first proper courting dinner?" "Because he was part of your life, part of what made you who you are," Rowan said simply. "And because if we're going to move forward, and I hope we are, then I need to understand where you've been. I'm not threatened by his memory, Clara. I'm not trying to replace him or compete with him. I just want to know the whole of you, and he's part of that story." The thoughtfulness of it, the mature understanding that her past didn't have to be hidden or ignored, loosened something in Clara's chest. She set down her fork and took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "Thomas was a good man," she said finally. "Kind, ambitious, full of dreams about what we could build out west. He wanted land, wanted to create something lasting for our children. He saw opportunity where I saw risk, and his enthusiasm was infectious enough that I agreed to leave everything familiar and come out here with him. Do you regret it, coming west? Clara considered that. I regret how it turned out. I regret that he died and left us stranded. But do I regret the choice itself? I don't know. Maybe if we'd stayed in Kansas City, things would have been better, maybe worse. There's no way to know what might have been. What was he like? As a husband? As a father? He loved the children fiercely, Clara said, her voice growing thick with emotion. He was patient with them, playful in a way I never quite managed to be. He'd carve toys for Samuel, tell elaborate stories to Emma, spend hours just holding Grace when she was fussy. He wasn't perfect. He could be impractical, too focused on dreams and not enough on reality, but he tried. He really tried to give us a good life. Sounds like a man worth remembering, Rowan said quietly. He was. Clara paused, then decided to push forward with honesty. But Rowan, I need you to understand something. I love Thomas. Part of me always will. He gave me my children, he was my partner for years, and his death nearly destroyed me. But that love lives in the past. It's a memory, not a present reality. And what I'm feeling now, what's growing between us, that's not a betrayal of him. That's me choosing to keep living instead of becoming a ghost myself. Rowan's grip on her hand tightened. I needed to hear that, he admitted. I've been worried that I was pushing too hard, moving too fast, not giving you enough time to grieve properly. There is no proper way to grieve, Clara said. Everyone tells you there are stages, that you need time, that there are rules about how long you should wait before moving on. But grief isn't neat like that. It's messy and complicated, and it doesn't follow anyone's timeline. I'll probably always carry some sadness about Thomas, some guilt about the circumstances of his death and what came after. But that doesn't mean I'm not ready to feel something new, something different, with someone else. With me, Rowan said, making it a statement rather than a question. With you, Clara confirmed, feeling her cheeks heat. If you'll have me, with all my complications and children and trauma. Clara, I wouldn't want you any other way. The complications and children are part of the package, and the trauma... He paused, searching for words. The trauma is what made you strong enough to survive. I'm not interested in some idealized version of you that never struggled. I want the real woman sitting across from me right now, with all her scars and strengths and the 3 children who are probably driving Mrs. Chen to distraction as we speak. Clara laughed at that, the tension breaking. Grace was trying to climb into the flour barrel when we left. Mrs. Chen is definitely earning her evening babysitting fee. They finished dinner in better spirits, the serious conversation having cleared the air between them. Over coffee and a surprisingly good apple pie that Mr. Ferguson recommended, they talked about lighter things. Rowan's early days at the ranch, Clara's childhood in Boston, their shared opinions about various town personalities. It felt natural, easy, like talking to someone she'd known for years rather than months. When they finally emerged from the hotel into the cold November night, Clara felt full in ways that had nothing to do with the meal. She felt seen, understood, accepted for exactly who she was. Not despite her struggles, but including them as part of the whole person, Rowan seemed determined to know and care for. Walk with me a bit before we head back, Rowan suggested, offering his arm. It's a nice night, and I'm not quite ready to share you with the children again yet. Clara slipped her hand through his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him even through his coat. They walked slowly down Green River's main street, which was quiet at this hour with most establishments closed for the evening. Lamplight spilled from windows here and there, and somewhere in the distance someone was playing a piano badly, but enthusiastically. I have something to tell you, Rowan said after they'd walked a ways in comfortable silence. Something I probably should have mentioned before, but didn't know how to bring up. Clara felt anxiety spike in her chest. This was it, the catch, the hidden complication, the thing that would make all of this too good to be true. What is it? Mr. Blackwood, the ranch owner, he's getting on in years and his health isn't what it used to be. He's been talking about retirement, about maybe selling the ranch or finding someone to take it over. And he's indicated that he might be willing to make me a partner if I can come up with part of the purchase price. Rowan, that's wonderful, Clara said, relief flooding through her that this wasn't bad news. That's what you've been working toward, isn't it? It is, Rowan agreed. But here's the thing. If it happens, if I become part owner of the dusty spur that comes with the main ranch house, the big house where Mr. Blackwood lives now, it's got 5 bedrooms, Clara, a real kitchen with a proper stove, a parlor, and a dining room, space for a family. He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I'm not proposing. Not yet. Not tonight. I know it's too soon and you need more time and there are conversations we still need to have. But I want you to know that when I think about my future, when I imagine what that big house could be, you're there. You and Emma and Samuel and Grace. That's the picture in my head. That's what I'm working toward. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. Rowan, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. I just wanted you to know where my heart is, where my intentions lie. So there's no confusion, no wondering what I want. I want you, Clara. I want a life with you and your children, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to want that too. Clara looked at this man who'd saved them from a storm and then kept saving them every day since, with shelter and work and patience and genuine care. This man who treated her children like they mattered, who saw her as something more than a charity case, who talked about the future like it was something they could build together instead of something that would just happen to them. I already want it, she whispered. I'm terrified of wanting it, and part of me keeps waiting for something to go wrong. But Rowan, I want it. I want that future with you. The joy that lit his face was almost painful to witness. He pulled her close, and Clara went willingly, resting her head against his chest and feeling his heart hammering beneath her ear. They stood there in the middle of Green River's main street, holding each other under the cold stars. And Clara felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling, some last defense falling away. She was going to love this man. She was probably already falling in love with him, had been since he'd first insisted she'd sleep under a roof that stormy night months ago. And the terrifying, wonderful truth was that she thought he was falling in love with her too. We should get back, Rowan said eventually, his voice rough with emotion. Mrs. Chen will have our heads if we're too late. The ride back to the ranch passed in a warm haze. Clara's arms wrapped around Rowan's waist, her cheek pressed against his back. When they reached the main house to collect the children, they found chaos. Emma trying to teach Mrs. Chen how to braid hair, Samuel had somehow gotten covered in flour from head to toe, and Grace was asleep in a basket near the stove like a contented kitten. Your children are demons, Mrs. Chen announced, but her eyes were twinkling. Wonderful demons, but demons. Take them home before they destroy my kitchen completely. The children were full of questions on the ride back to the cabin. How was dinner? What did you eat? Did you have fun? Are you going to get married? Delivered with the brutal directness of youth who saw no reason to be subtle about their hopes. We had a very nice time, Claire said diplomatically, and that's all you need to know for now. But you like him, right, Mama? Emma pressed. You like Rowan? Clara met Rowan's eyes over Emma's head and saw him waiting for her answer with the same intensity as her daughter. Yes, she said softly. I like him very much. Good, Samuel declared, because we like him too, and it would be weird if you didn't like him back. The simple logic of it made both adults laugh, and the rest of the ride passed in companionable conversation. At the cabin, Rowan helped get the children inside and into bed, a process that involved much stalling and requests for water, and suddenly remembered important questions that absolutely couldn't wait until morning. Finally, with all 3 children tucked in and drowsing, Clara walked Rowan to the door. They stood in the threshold like they had so many times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a beginning, rather than just another evening in a series of evenings. Thank you, Clara said. For dinner, for the conversation, for being patient with me and my complications. Thank you for taking a chance on me, Rowan replied, for being willing to trust again despite everything you've been through. He leaned down slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was chaste, respectful, nothing that could be considered improper, but it was also loaded with promise, with affection, with the potential for so much more. Good night, Clara. Good night, Rowan. She stood in the doorway watching him ride away, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had been, her heart full of hope and fear and something that felt dangerously like joy. Behind her, she heard Emma's voice, whisper shouting from the bed. "Mama, did he kiss you?" "Go to sleep, Emma," Clara said, but she was smiling as she said it. The next weeks passed in a blur of routine and growing intimacy. Rowan continued his evening visits, now openly acknowledged as courting calls rather than maintenance checks. He brought small gifts, a hair ribbon for Emma, a new jackknife for Samuel, a stuffed rabbit for Grace. He stayed for supper most nights, helping Clara cook, washing dishes while she dried, playing with the children before bedtime with the easy affection of someone who genuinely enjoyed their company. And slowly, carefully, he and Clara learned each other. They talked about everything: his difficult childhood with an absent father and a mother who'd struggled to survive, her privileged upbringing that had made the harsh realities of frontier life such a shock, their hopes for the future, their fears about all the ways things could go wrong. They talked about Thomas more too, Clara sharing memories without guilt, Rowan listening without jealousy. He seemed to understand that her first husband would always be part of her story, that the children needed to remember their father, that loving someone new didn't require erasing the love that came before. In late November, the first real snow fell. Not the light dustings they'd had earlier, but a serious storm that blanketed the plains in white and made travel treacherous. Clara and the children were snowed in at the cabin for 3 days, and Rowan appeared on the second day, having ridden through conditions that Clara wouldn't have attempted, bringing supplies and firewood and his presence. "You didn't have to come," Clara said, touched and exasperated in equal measure. "We would have been fine." "I know you would have," Rowan replied, stomping snow off his boots. "But I wanted to make sure, wanted to see with my own eyes that you had enough wood, enough food, that the children were warm." The fact that he'd risked the journey just to check on them said more than any words could have about how much he cared. And when the storm worsened that evening, making it impossible for him to safely return to the bunkhouse, Clara made up a pallet by the fire for him without any awkwardness or concerns about propriety. They were past that now, past the point of worrying what others might think. What mattered was that they trusted each other, cared for each other, were building something real together. That night, with the wind howling outside and the children asleep, and Rowan's presence making the cabin feel complete, Clara lay in her bed and thought about how far they'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been living in a tent, watching her children slowly starve, certain that they'd all die on the Wyoming plains without anyone caring or noticing. And now she had work, shelter, security, and the promise of something that looked remarkably like love. The storm broke on the third day, revealing a world transformed by snow. The children were ecstatic, running outside to play in the drifts, building a lopsided snowman that Samuel insisted had to be named Thunder after his beloved colt. Rowan stayed to help dig out paths and make sure the cabin weathered the storm without damage before finally heading back to his duties at the ranch. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised Clara at the door. "Mr. Blackwood wants to talk to me about the partnership. It might be happening sooner than we thought." "That's wonderful," Clara said, meaning it. "I'll keep my fingers crossed for you." But the next evening, when Rowan arrived, his expression was troubled. Clara knew immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, as soon as the children were occupied with their own activities and she and Rowan could speak privately on the porch. "Mr. Blackwood is ready to move forward with the partnership," Rowan said. "But there's a complication. His nephew, a man named Garrett Blackwood who lives back east, has expressed interest in the ranch. He's offering to buy the whole operation outright, for more money than Mr. Blackwood would get from selling me a partnership share." Clara felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "So what does that mean?" "It means Mr. Blackwood is considering the offer," Rowan said, his jaw tight with frustration. "The nephew has money, connections, business experience. On paper, he's the better choice. And if Mr. Blackwood sells to him instead of bringing me on as partner, then I lose the main house, lose the opportunity I've been working toward for years." "But you'd still have your job," Clara said, trying to find the positive. "You'd still be foreman." "Maybe," Rowan said grimly. "Or maybe Garrett Blackwood brings in his own people, his own foreman. Maybe he cleans house and starts fresh. That's what businessmen from back east tend to do when they buy Western properties. Remake them in their own image, get rid of anyone who might represent the old way of doing things." The implications of what he was saying hit Clara like a physical blow. If Rowan lost his position, he'd have to find work elsewhere. He'd have to leave the Dusty Spur, maybe leave Green River entirely. And if he left— Clara, Rowan said urgently, taking her hands, whatever happens, this doesn't change what I feel for you. If I have to leave, if I have to find work somewhere else, I'll find a way to come back, or I'll take you with me. I'm not letting you go no matter what Garrett Blackwood does or doesn't do. You can't promise that, Clara said, her voice shaking. You can't know what choices you'll have to make, what opportunities might come up elsewhere. And I can't uproot my children again, Rowan. Not when they're finally settled, finally stable. I can't drag them from place to place chasing another uncertain future. Then I'll stay, Rowan said fiercely. I'll find work at another ranch nearby, something close enough that I can still see you. Clara, I meant what I said. I want a future with you. I'm not walking away from that because of some business complication. Clara wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true, that the best intentions could crumble under the weight of practical necessity. What if Rowan couldn't find work nearby? What if the only opportunities were states away? What if this beautiful thing they'd been building was about to be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, just like everything else in her life seemed to be destroyed? We'll figure it out, Rowan promised, pulling her close. I don't know how yet, but we'll find a way. Trust me, Clara. Please trust me. She wanted to. She did trust him, actually. Trusted his intentions, his sincerity, his genuine care for her and the children. What she didn't trust was the universe, fate, whatever force seemed determined to take away everything good in her life just when she started to believe in it. But she nodded against his chest anyway, choosing hope over fear, choosing to believe that maybe this time things would work out, that maybe the story didn't have to end in loss and heartbreak. The next weeks were tense with uncertainty. Rowan continued his visits, but there was an undercurrent of worry in everything they did, a shadow over their growing attachment. Mr. Blackwood's nephew was apparently taking his time making a final decision, and the waiting was excruciating. Clara threw herself into her work, taking on extra mending projects, saving every penny she could in case she needed to move the children again, in case the cabin was lost, in case everything fell apart. Again. Emma noticed her mother's stress and tried to help by being extra good, extra responsible, taking over more household tasks without being asked. Samuel became quieter, more withdrawn, as if he sensed that something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. Even Grace seemed affected, more clingy than usual, crying when Clara left her sight. It was Mrs. Chen who finally confronted Clara about it. "You are walking around like a ghost," the older woman announced one morning in the sewing room, hands on hips in her characteristic no-nonsense stance. "Jumping at every sound, anxious all the time. This is because of the nephew, yes? Because of worry about Rowan's position?" Clara nodded miserably. "If Mr. Blackwood sells to his nephew, everything changes. Rowan might lose his job. We might lose the cabin. I might lose my work here. And I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't go through that again, Mrs. Chen. I can't watch everything fall apart again. It nearly killed us the first time." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes assessing Clara with an intensity that made her want to squirm. Then she sighed heavily and sat down across from Clara at the work table. "I will tell you something," Mrs. Chen said slowly, "but you must promise not to repeat it, not even to Rowan. Not yet. You understand?" Clara nodded, confused but attentive. "Mr. Blackwood, he is old, yes, and his health is not good, but he is not a fool. He sees what his nephew is, a man who cares about money and status, not about land or people or the ranch that has been in his family for 30 years. Garrett Blackwood wants to buy the property, but he will not care for it the way it deserves. He will not care for the people who work here, who have given years of their lives to the Dusty Spur." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Mr. Blackwood talks to me because I have been here since the beginning, since his wife was still alive. And he has said, though not in these exact words, that he would prefer to see Rowan become his partner, that he trusts Rowan to maintain what has been built here. The nephew's offer is tempting because it is easy, because it is a simple transaction, but easy is not always right." "So what are you saying?" Clara asked, hope beginning to flicker in her chest. "That Mr. Blackwood might choose Rowan after all." I am saying that Mr. Blackwood needs a reason to choose the harder path, Mrs. Chen said. A reminder of what matters more than money. And I think you might be that reason, if you are brave enough. I don't understand. Mrs. Chen smiled, small and knowing. Mr. Blackwood cares about family, about legacy. His nephew has no children, no wife, no real ties to this place beyond blood and potential profit. But Rowan, if Rowan had a family, had children who would grow up on this ranch, had a reason to put down deep roots and build something lasting, that would mean something to a man like Mr. Blackwood. That would be the kind of legacy he wants for the Dusty Spur. The implication of what Mrs. Chen was suggesting hit Clara like a thunderbolt. You're saying I should, what? Propose to Rowan? Force the issue? I am saying you should stop waiting for life to happen to you and start making choices about what you want, Mrs. Chen replied firmly. You love Rowan, yes? Clara hesitated, then pushed through her fear of saying it aloud. Yes. Yes, I love him. And he loves you, and the children love him, and everyone can see you belong together except you are both being so careful, so patient, waiting for the perfect time that may never come. Mrs. Chen stood, brushing imaginary dust from her apron. Sometimes the perfect time is right now, before circumstances force different choices. Sometimes you must leap before you are ready and trust that you will figure out how to fly on the way down. She left Clara sitting at the work table, mind reeling with possibilities and fears, and a wild, desperate hope that maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe Clara had been so focused on protecting herself from more loss that she was missing the chance to claim something worth having. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid and start fighting for the future she wanted. That evening, when Rowan arrived for his usual visit, Clara made a decision. She waited until the children were in bed, until they had privacy on the porch under a sky full of stars. And then she took a deep breath and dove in. Rowan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the truth is complicated. He turned to her, concern in his eyes. Of course. Ask me anything. Clara gathered her courage, thinking of everything they'd been through, everything they'd built together, everything they stood to lose if she didn't take this chance. If you could have what you wanted, the partnership, the ranch house, a family to fill it with, would you want that with me? Would you want to marry me, make a life together, raise my children as yours? Rowan stared at her, stunned into silence. Clara pushed forward before she lost her nerve. Because I love you, Rowan Tate. I think I've loved you since you pulled us out of that storm, though I've been too scared to admit it. And I know it's only been a few months, and I know there are 1,000 practical reasons why we should wait. But I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of being careful. I want to choose happiness while I still have the chance. So I'm asking you, will you marry me? For a moment that stretched into eternity, Rowan just stared at Clara, his expression unreadable in the starlight. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She'd done it. She'd taken the leap Mrs. Chen had talked about, had thrown herself into the void with nothing but hope to break her fall. And now she waited, suspended in that terrible space between question and answer, between possibility and reality. Then Rowan's face transformed, wonder and joy breaking across his features like sunrise over the plains. He reached into his vest pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a small velvet box that looked worn with age and handling. I've been carrying this for 2 weeks, he said, his voice rough with emotion, trying to work up the courage to ask you the same question. My mother's ring, the only thing I have left of her. I wanted to wait until the situation with the ranch was settled, until I could offer you security and certainty. But Clara... He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a single pearl, luminous in the dim light. Yes, God, yes, I'll marry you. I want nothing more than to spend my life with you and those children. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as Rowan slipped from the porch to kneel before her on one knee, the traditional position reversed, but somehow perfect in its unexpectedness. He took her hand, and she could feel him shaking, feel the depth of emotion he was barely containing. Clara Jennings, he said formally, his voice steadier now. You've asked me to marry you, and I've said yes. But let me ask you proper, the way I've been planning to. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me be a father to Emma and Samuel and Grace? Will you build a future with me, whatever that future looks like, wherever it takes us?" "Yes," Clara whispered, then louder. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. And then he was standing, pulling her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been building for months, that tasted of hope and promise and forever. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring into it all the love she'd been too afraid to speak aloud, all the dreams she'd been too scared to claim. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she heard squealing from inside the cabin and realized the children had been watching through the window. The door burst open and all three of them came tumbling out, Emma launching herself at Rowan, Samuel grabbing his legs, Grace toddling over with arms raised to be picked up. "Does this mean you're going to be our papa?" Samuel asked, his voice muffled against Rowan's thigh. "If you'll have me," Rowan replied, somehow managing to scoop up all three children while keeping one arm around Clara. "If you want me to be your papa, then that's exactly what I'll be." "We want it," Emma declared. "We've wanted it forever. Right, Samuel?" "Right," Samuel agreed enthusiastically. "Can I call you Papa now, or do we have to wait until after the wedding?" "You can call me whatever you want," Rowan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Papa, Pa, Dad, whatever feels right to you." "Papa," Samuel decided immediately, testing out the word. "Papa Rowan." Grace, not to be left out, patted Rowan's face with her small hand and declared, "Papa!" with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old who'd just made a momentous decision. They stayed out on the porch for another hour, too excited to think about sleep, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. The children had endless questions. When would the wedding be? Where would they live? Could Thunder the Colt come to the wedding? That Rowan and Clara answered as best they could despite not having worked out most of the details themselves. Finally, when Grace started nodding off against Rowan's shoulder and Samuel couldn't stop yawning, they got the children back to bed. This time, when Rowan prepared to leave, Clara stopped him at the door. "Don't go," she said softly. "Stay. Not," she blushed, "not like that. Not yet. But stay here with us. Sleep by the fire like you did during the storm. I don't want to spend tonight apart, not after this." Rowan's eyes were soft as he nodded. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." So he stayed, and Clara lay in her bed listening to his steady breathing from across the room, looking at the ring on her finger that caught the dying firelight, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Absolute certainty that everything was going to be all right. Not just survivable, not just tolerable, but actually genuinely all right. The next morning, they rode together to the main ranch house to share their news. Mrs. Chen took one look at Clara's glowing face and Rowan's proud expression and announced, "Finally, I thought you two would never stop being so careful with each other." "You knew," Clara accused, but she was smiling. "You knew he had the ring." "Of course I knew," Mrs. Chen replied. "Who do you think helped him pick it? Men know nothing about such things. They need guidance." She examined the ring on Clara's finger with a critical eye and nodded approvingly. "Good choice. Simple, elegant, suits you. Now, we must tell Mr. Blackwood. This will matter to him, you know. This will help him make his decision." She led them to Mr. Blackwood's study, where the old rancher was reviewing papers with the kind of frustrated expression that suggested his failing eyesight was making the task difficult. He looked up when they entered, and Clara saw him take in their joined hands, the ring on her finger, the way they stood close together like two halves of a whole. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair with a slight smile, "this looks like news worth hearing." "Mr. Blackwood," Rowan said formally, "I'd like to introduce you to my fiancée, Clara Jennings. We're engaged to be married." "Are you now?" Mr. Blackwood's smile widened. "And when did this happen?" "Last night, sir. I know the timing might seem sudden, given the uncertainty with your nephew's offer, but—" "Sudden?" Mr. Blackwood interrupted. "Son, I've been watching you court this lady for months. The only sudden thing is that it took you so long to make it official. Mrs. Chen's been giving me daily updates on your progress, or lack thereof. The whole ranch has been taking bets on when you'd finally ask her." Rowan looked stunned, and Clara had to suppress a laugh. Apparently their relationship had been far less private than they'd thought. "Sir," Rowan continued, gathering himself. I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the ranch, whether you sell to your nephew or not, my commitment to Clara and her children stands. If I need to find work elsewhere to provide for them, I will. But we're hoping, that we might still have a future here at the Dusty Spur. Mr. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his weathered fingers tapping on the desk. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. My nephew Garrett is offering me a substantial sum for this ranch, more money than I'd see from any other arrangement. From a purely financial standpoint, accepting his offer would be the smart choice. Clara felt her stomach drop, but Rowan's hand tightened on hers, lending her strength. However, Mr. Blackwood continued, I didn't build this ranch to be smart with money. I built it to be a home, a legacy, something that would outlast me and mean something to the people who worked it. Garrett sees this place as an investment opportunity, nothing more. He'd run it like a business, maximize profits, probably replace most of the staff with cheaper labor within a year. He stood slowly, age evident in his movements, and walked to the window overlooking the ranch yard. You know what I see when I look out there, Rowan? I see the life my wife and I built together before she passed. I see 30 years of hard work and good people and belonging to something bigger than just profit margins. And when I think about this place after I'm gone, I don't want to imagine it transformed into just another corporate operation. I want to imagine it continuing as it's been, as a home. He turned back to face them. You've been with me for 8 years, Rowan. I've watched you grow from a young hand with more ambition than sense into a fine foreman, a good man, someone I'd trust with my legacy. And now you're telling me you're starting a family, putting down roots, planning to build something lasting here. He paused, his eyes moving to Clara. Mrs. Jennings, you've been through hell from what I understand. You've survived what would have broken lesser people, and you've raised 3 good children in the process. That speaks to character, to strength. Those are the kind of people I want running this ranch when I'm gone. Sir? Rowan's voice was uncertain, hope warring with disbelief. I'm turning down my nephew's offer, Mr. Blackwood said decisively. I'm moving forward with our original partnership agreement. You'll have 6 months to come up with your portion of the purchase price. We can work out payment terms that make sense. And in the meantime, you and your new family can move into the main house. Consider it part of the arrangement. A foreman who's also a partner should live in the main house, not in the bunkhouse, especially a foreman with a wife and children to look after. Clara couldn't contain her gasp. The main house, the beautiful, spacious home she'd admired from a distance, with its 5 bedrooms and real kitchen and solid walls. For her and her children, for their new family. Mr. Blackwood, I don't know what to say, Rowan managed, his voice thick with emotion. Say you'll take care of this place the way it deserves, Mr. Blackwood replied. Say you'll raise those children to know what it means to build something with your own hands, to be part of a community, to value people over profits. Say you'll make this ranch into the home it's always been meant to be. I promise, Rowan said solemnly. We both do. We'll honor what you've built here, sir. We'll make you proud. I know you will, Mr. Blackwood said. Now get out of my office and let me break the news to my nephew. He's not going to take it well, but that's not your problem. Go start planning your wedding. Mrs. Chen will want to help with that, I'm sure. They left the study in a daze, hardly able to process what had just happened. Everything they'd been worried about, everything that had seemed so uncertain just yesterday, had suddenly resolved itself in the best possible way. The partnership, the house, the future, all of it was theirs, real and tangible and within reach. I can't believe it, Clara whispered once they were outside. Is this really happening? It's happening, Rowan confirmed, pulling her close. You and me and the children, in that house, building a life together. This is real, Clara. This is our second chance. The next weeks passed in a flurry of wedding preparations and moving arrangements. Clara and Mrs. Chen threw themselves into planning a ceremony that would be simple but meaningful, to be held at the Green River Church in mid-December. Emma was beside herself with excitement about being old enough to be a junior bridesmaid. Samuel had been tasked with being ring bearer and took his responsibility with solemn seriousness. Grace would be a flower girl, though at 3 years old her primary qualification was looking adorable in a white dress. Moving into the main house was an overwhelming experience. Clara stood in the large kitchen with its cast iron stove and multiple work surfaces and actual storage cupboards, and had to sit down because the contrast with the tent where she'd once tried to cook over an open fire was too much to process. The children ran through the rooms shrieking with delight, claiming bedrooms and exploring closets, and discovering a library with actual books on the second floor. "This is too much," Clara kept saying to Rowan as they unpacked their few belongings, which looked ridiculously sparse in the spacious house. "We don't deserve this." "You deserve everything," Rowan corrected firmly. "You've earned this 1,000 times over, Clara. Stop questioning it and just let yourself be happy." Mrs. Chen, meanwhile, had taken Clara's measurements and somehow produced a wedding dress, a simple white gown with lace at the collar and cuffs, fitted through the bodice and flowing in the skirt. When Clara tried it on for the first time, she looked in the full-length mirror in what was now her bedroom and barely recognized herself. The gaunt, desperate woman who'd lived in a tent was gone, replaced by someone who looked healthy, happy, loved. The wedding itself was set for December 18th, a Saturday that dawned cold but brilliantly clear, with sunlight sparkling off snow in the Wyoming sky, that particular shade of blue that seemed impossible anywhere else. The church was packed with people from the ranch and town, some who'd known Clara from her desperate days and seemed genuinely happy to see how far she'd come, others who'd never met her but came to support Rowan, who was well-liked in the community. Clara stood in the church's small preparation room, her hands shaking as Emma and Mrs. Chen helped her with final adjustments to her dress. She could hear the church filling up outside, the murmur of voices and occasional bursts of laughter that spoke of a community gathering to celebrate. "Mama, you look like a princess," Emma breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "She looks like a bride," Mrs. Chen corrected, "which is better than a princess because it is real, not a fairy tale." "Is it normal to be this nervous?" Clara asked, pressing a hand to her stomach, where butterflies seemed to have taken up permanent residence. "I've done this before. I've been married. I shouldn't be this scared." "It is different this time," Mrs. Chen said wisely. "The first time you were young, you did not know what marriage meant, what life would bring. This time, you know. You have seen the worst life can offer, and you are choosing this anyway. That makes it more precious, yes, but also more frightening because you know what you could lose." Clara nodded, the truth of that hitting home. She knew exactly what she stood to lose now. This man who'd saved her, these children who were thriving, this life they'd built from the ashes of disaster. The stakes felt impossibly high. "But Mama," Emma said softly, taking her hand, "you won't lose him. Papa Rowan isn't going anywhere. He promised, remember? He always keeps his promises." The simple faith in her daughter's voice steadied Clara. Emma was right. Rowan did keep his promises. He'd promised to help them that stormy night, and he had. He'd promised they'd be safe, and they were. He'd promised to build a future with them, and here they stood on the threshold of that future, real and solid and waiting. There was a knock on the door, and the Reverend poked his head in. "We're ready when you are, Mrs. Jennings." Clara took a deep breath, squeezed Emma's hand, and nodded. "I'm ready." The ceremony was a blur of sensory details that Clara would spend years trying to fully remember. The church was decorated with pine boughs and white ribbons that Mrs. Chen and some of the ranch women had spent days arranging. Samuel stood at the front with the rings on a small pillow, his face serious with responsibility. Grace toddled down the aisle, scattering flower petals with more enthusiasm than precision, making the congregation laugh. And then there was Rowan, waiting at the altar in a new suit that Clara suspected Mrs. Chen had bullied him into buying. His hair neatly combed, his eyes locked on Clara as she walked toward him on Mr. Blackwood's arm. The old rancher having offered to give her away in the absence of her own father, who was thousands of miles away in Boston and hadn't been invited. The Reverend spoke words about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage, but Clara heard them as if from a distance. All her attention was focused on Rowan, on the man who'd refused to ride past a desperate family, who'd seen worth in her when she could see none in herself, who'd patiently courted her through her fear and grief, and finally proposed that they build something beautiful together from the wreckage of her old life. "Do you, Clara Marie Jennings, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part. Clara thought about Thomas, about the first time she'd said these words, young and naive and certain that nothing bad could ever happen. She thought about how wrong she'd been, how quickly better had become worse, how richer had turned to poorer, how health had succumbed to sickness and death had parted them far too soon. But she also thought about the woman she'd become since then, stronger, wiser, more resilient. She thought about how she'd survived what should have killed her, how she'd kept her children alive through sheer determination, how she'd learned that second chances existed if you were brave enough to reach for them. "I do," she said clearly, her voice steady and sure. "And do you, Rowan James Tate, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Rowan said, his voice rough with emotion, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Rowan pulled Clara close and kissed her with a gentleness that made her heart ache, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying, happy tears this time, tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming sense that everything they'd been through had led to this moment, had been worth it for this. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, past smiling faces and well-wishers, out into the cold December sunlight where rice and flower petals were thrown and congratulations shouted. The children swarmed them immediately, Samuel talking a mile a minute about how he'd done his job perfectly, Emma beaming with pride, Grace demanding to be picked up by Papa. The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by what seemed like half of Green River. There was roast beef and chicken, fresh bread and pies, vegetables and side dishes of every description. There was music and dancing, laughter and celebration that went on for hours. Clara danced with Rowan, with Mr. Blackwood, with several ranch hands who'd become friends over the past months. She accepted congratulations from townspeople, some of whom had turned her away when she'd been desperate for work and now seemed to have conveniently forgotten that part. She chose to let it go, to forgive, if not forget, because holding on to bitterness would only poison the happiness she'd found. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Clara found herself standing with Rowan by the window, watching snow begin to fall softly outside. His arm was around her waist, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling safe in a way she'd never quite felt before. "What are you thinking?" Rowan asked softly. "I'm thinking about a year ago," Clara replied. "How different everything was. How desperate and afraid I was. How certain I was that we were all going to die on those plains." She paused, her throat tight with emotion. "And I'm thinking about how wrong I was. How sometimes when everything seems darkest, when you're absolutely certain there's no way forward, life surprises you. Someone rides up out of a storm and offers you shelter. And if you're brave enough to accept it, to trust it, it turns into something more than you ever imagined possible." "I'm the lucky one," Rowan said. "Do you know that? That storm could have sent me on a different path, could have had me riding home a different way. But it didn't. It brought me to you, to them. It gave me a family I didn't even know I was looking for." "We're all lucky," Clara corrected. "All of us, you, me, the children. We found each other when we all needed finding. That's not luck, that's something more. That's grace." Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the children had been collected by Mrs. Chen, who'd offered to keep them overnight to give the newlyweds privacy, Clara and Rowan stood in the main house, their house now, looking around at the space that would hold their future. "I have something for you," Rowan said, disappearing into the study and returning with a wooden box. "I've been working on this for months, waiting for the right time to give it to you." Clara opened the box to find a small metal nameplate, beautifully engraved. The Tate Family Ranch, founded 1873, Rowan, Clara, Emma, Samuel, and Grace. "I wanted you to know," Rowan said quietly, "that this isn't just my dream or my achievement. This is ours, all of ours. Your name belongs here just as much as mine. The children's names belong here. This is our family's legacy now, built together, earned together. Clara felt tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time that day. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect. This is all perfect." "Not perfect," Rowan corrected gently, pulling her close. "Real. Better than perfect, because it's real and earned and ours." The winter months passed in domestic contentment that Clara had to keep reminding herself was actually her life now, not some elaborate dream she'd wake from. She settled into running the household with Mrs. Chen's guidance, learning the rhythms of ranch life from the inside. Emma continued school and helped with the younger children. Samuel spent every spare moment with Thunder, who was growing into a fine young horse. Grace blossomed with the security of a permanent home, her vocabulary expanding daily as she chattered to anyone who would listen. And Rowan worked alongside Mr. Blackwood, learning the business side of ranching, preparing to take over more responsibility as the old man gradually stepped back. In the evenings, he'd come home to find Clara cooking dinner in the big kitchen, the children doing homework or playing, the house warm and filled with the sounds of family life. It was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, the mundane miracle of a normal, happy life after so much darkness. In March, as winter began its reluctant retreat and the first hints of spring appeared on the plains, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't wanted to say anything until she was certain, hadn't wanted to create expectations that might be disappointed. But when the town doctor confirmed it, she could no longer keep the secret. She told Rowan that evening on the porch, where they'd spent so many important conversations over the past year. "I have news," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to need to expand that nameplate. There's going to be another Tate joining the family come October." The expression on Rowan's face cycled through surprise to wonder to pure joy so quickly Clara almost laughed. We're having a baby," Clara confirmed, her own joy mixing with the familiar anxiety of pregnancy, with memories of carrying Emma and Samuel and Grace under very different circumstances. Rowan dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapped around her waist. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this, for everything, for giving me a family I never thought I'd have." "You gave me one first," Clara replied, running her fingers through his hair. "You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. This baby. This is just us continuing what we started that night you found us in the storm. We're building something together, something lasting." The children were ecstatic when they learned they'd be getting a sibling. Emma immediately started planning how she'd help take care of the baby. Samuel wanted to know if he could teach the baby about horses. Grace, not entirely clear on the concept, just knew that something exciting was happening and was determined to be part of it. Mr. Blackwood, upon hearing the news, expedited the partnership paperwork. "A man with 4 children and another on the way needs security," he declared. "Let's make this official before that baby arrives." So on a warm April day, with wildflowers blooming across the plains and the sky impossibly blue overhead, Rowan and Mr. Blackwood signed the papers that made Rowan a full partner in the Dusty Spur Ranch. There was a small celebration at the main house, with Mrs. Chen cooking a feast and the ranch hands raising toasts to the new partnership. Clara stood watching her husband, still strange to think of him that way, still wonderful, as he accepted congratulations from people who'd become their community, their family. She thought about the long, winding road that had brought her here, from Boston society to a tent on the Wyoming plains to this moment of triumph and belonging. The road had been hard, harder than anything she'd imagined when she'd naively agreed to come west with Thomas. She'd lost so much along the way, her husband, her security, nearly her children, almost her will to survive. But she'd also gained things she'd never expected, strength she didn't know she possessed, resilience that had been forged in the fire of desperation, and ultimately this second chance at happiness with a man who saw her scars and loved her anyway. Summer arrived with its characteristic intensity, heat shimmering off the plains and thunderstorms rolling through with regularity. Clara's pregnancy progressed normally, her body rounding with new life while the children fussed over her, and Rowan treated her like she was made of glass. She continued her sewing work, though Mrs. Chen had taken over more of the household management, insisting Clara needed to rest. The baby was born on an October evening when the air had turned crisp and the leaves on the cottonwoods had gone gold. It was an easier birth than the others had been, perhaps because Clara was less afraid this time, more certain that everything would be all right. The doctor pronounced it a healthy boy, 8 pounds and loud as a trumpet from his first breath. "What should we name him?" Rowan asked, cradling his son with the careful reverence of a man holding something infinitely precious and fragile. Clara thought about all the names that had meaning in her life, her father's name, Thomas's father's name, various relatives and friends from her old life. But none of them felt right. This baby represented something new, a fresh start, a life untainted by past loss or grief. "Hope," she said softly. "I want to name him Hope, because that's what he represents. Hope that good things can happen after bad, that life can surprise you, that second chances exist if you're brave enough to claim them." "Hope Tate," Rowan tested the name. "It's unusual for a boy." "We're an unusual family," Claire replied with a tired smile. "I think it fits." When the older children were allowed to meet their new brother, they crowded around with wonder and excitement. Emma touched his tiny hand with reverent care. Samuel proclaimed him, "Really small, but okay, I guess." Grace wanted to know when he'd be big enough to play with her toys. And Clara lay in their bed in the main house of the ranch her husband now co-owned, surrounded by her children, all 4 of them healthy and happy and safe, and felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. She'd survived. They'd all survived. More than that, they'd done something she'd thought impossible in those dark days in the tent. They'd thrived. The years that followed were marked by the normal rhythms of ranch life and family. Emma grew into a capable young woman who eventually went east to attend a teaching college, determined to return to Wyoming and open a proper school. Samuel became his father's right hand on the ranch, with a natural gift for working with horses that made him sought after across the territory. Grace developed a talent for art, filling the house with drawings and paintings that captured the beauty of the Wyoming landscape. And Hope grew up knowing nothing but security and love, a child who'd never experienced hunger or fear or uncertainty, who took for granted the stable home his mother had fought so hard to provide. Mr. Blackwood passed away peacefully in his sleep 5 years after the partnership was formed, leaving his remaining share of the ranch to Rowan and Clara in his will. They renamed it officially then, the Tate Family Ranch, making permanent the legacy they'd been building. Clara never forgot the tent, never forgot what it felt like to watch her children slowly starve, never forgot the bone-deep terror of having nowhere to turn and no one to help. Those memories lived in her always, a shadow that never fully disappeared but that also made every good day brighter by contrast. She used those memories to help other struggling families who arrived in Green River over the years, offering work and shelter and the same kind of grace that had been extended to her when she needed it most. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Rowan and Clara stood on the porch of their home watching the sunset over the Wyoming plains they'd come to love. Their children were inside, most of them anyway, Emma having sent a letter from her teaching position in Cheyenne, and the ranch was prosperous, successful beyond what they'd dared to dream in those early uncertain days. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Rowan asked, his arm around Clara's expanding waist. She was pregnant again, a surprise at 40 years old, but a welcome one. "If that storm had come a day earlier or later, if I'd ridden a different path home, if you'd given up just a little bit sooner." "I try not to," Clara admitted. "It's too terrifying to think how close we came to missing this, how many small choices had to align perfectly for us to end up here." "But they did align," Rowan said. "Against all odds, against all logic, somehow we found each other. You were raising 3 kids in a tent, and I rode up out of nowhere and said you'd sleep under a roof that night. And that one act of basic human kindness turned into this, into a family, a home, a life." Clara leaned into her husband's warmth, watching the sky turn gold and orange and finally purple as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. And closer by, she heard Samuel's voice as he talked to the horses in the barn, the same gentle tones he'd learned from his stepfather all those years ago. "It wasn't just one act," Clara corrected softly. "It was 1,000 acts of kindness, day after day, choice after choice, to be patient and generous and hopeful when the easier path would have been to walk away. You didn't just give us a roof that night, Rowan. You gave us a future. You gave us back our lives. We gave each other a future, Rowan replied. You had the courage to accept help when every instinct told you it was dangerous. You had the strength to keep going when anyone else would have given up. You built this life as much as I did, Clara, maybe more. They stood there in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, the same stars that had shone down on a desperate widow in a failing tent a decade ago, the same stars that would shine down on their children and grandchildren long after they were gone. The Wyoming wind carried the smell of sage and grass and home, and somewhere in the house behind them, Hope laughed at something Samuel had said, the sound pure and joyful and utterly secure. Clara thought about writing a letter to her parents back in Boston, whom she hadn't spoken to since Thomas's death, to tell them about her life now. But she decided against it. They belonged to her old world, the world of society rules and expectations that had no place here on the plains. This was her real family now, not the one she'd been born into, but the one she'd chosen, the one she'd fought for, the one she'd built from nothing with a cowboy who'd appeared out of a storm and changed everything. I love you, she said simply, the words encompassing everything, gratitude and passion and partnership and the deep abiding affection that grew stronger with every passing year. I love you too, Rowan replied, today, tomorrow, and every day after that until there are no more days left. That's my promise, Clara. That's my forever. And standing there on the porch of their ranch house, with the night settling around them and their children safe inside, Clara finally fully believed in happy endings. Not the fairy tale kind that pretended life was easy and perfect, but the real kind that acknowledged the struggle, honored the pain, and celebrated the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would have been so much easier. She'd been raising 3 kids in a tent when a cowboy rode up and said she'd sleep under a roof that night. She hadn't known then that he was offering so much more than shelter from a storm. He was offering a partnership, a family, a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. She hadn't known that accepting his help would lead here, to this moment, to this life that was so far beyond what she dared to hope for in those desperate days. But she knew it now. She knew it in her bones, in her heart, in every fiber of her being. They'd survived the storm, all of them, and built something beautiful in its wake. And that was enough, more than enough. That was everything. The end.